So is this the only way I can turn pages? I cannot use the turn pages. I cannot use the keyboard, right?
No, yeah.
Oh, okay, that's fine.
Welcome back, everyone. So now we're going to move on to our third session on trade and environment. For this session, we have three presenters in the following order. Here we have Harry Lee from the University of Hong Kong, followed by Oscar Avila from Central Bank of Colombia, and Ziho Park from National Taiwan University. So there'll be 25 minutes for a presentation for each paper, followed by 15 minutes of open discussion. And we request the first 5 minutes of the presentation to not be interrupted. But after that 5 minutes, you're encouraged to ask any question. YouTube participants can post their question online, and we will find the right time to pose this question. And with that, please welcome Harry.
All right. Thanks a lot for having me. It's a great honor and pleasure to be here. So this work is joined with Alan Feng from the IMF and also my student at University of Hong Kong, Yulin Wang. Okay, so since we have an IMF co-author, so I'd like to make your disclaimer that the views in this paper are those of the authors and do not represent the views of the IMF. Okay, so we know that fighting climate change, we talk about climate change all the time. Fighting climate change requires international collaboration. Right, so from the point of view of emerging market economy, where we are right now, emerging market economy requires financing and good technologies from advanced economies to fight climate change, right? However, the consequences of climate change are unevenly distributed across countries. What I mean here is think about the cool and rich countries in the north, for example, Sweden. They're not really affected too much by global warming, right? But if you look at countries in the south, I mean, they're warm, they're hot, they're poor, and they're particularly vulnerable to climate change. Okay, so in this paper, we asked the following questions: so why should countries with low climate rates at home care about climate change? So we propose a new mechanism by which climate change affects countries' macro and financial performance, which is a cross-border propagation of climate risk through international trade. Okay. So to fix idea, and for those of you who are not really like working on this kind of questions, here's a simple example for the global value chain, right? So if you look at the country in the middle, we call it the midstream country. For example, in China, tire is produced, and to produce tires, Chinese companies source input, which is rubber from Thailand, right? And Thailand can be considered the upstream country. And if you look at downstream country, Japan produces cars. Okay, so what we do in this paper is to study the impact of climate disaster here. Let's say a disaster, unfortunately, here's China. How that affect macroeconomic performances and financial market in Thailand and in Japan, in upstream and downstream countries. Okay, so what we do here is we construct data sets on global macroeconomy, trade, stock market indices, climate disasters, transport infrastructures, and climate rates for the past half a century. Okay, and we link each climate disaster to the country that is directly affected by the climate disaster and the main upstream and downstream trade partners. Okay, the countries that trade most intensively with the countries that's hit by the climate disaster, and we determine whether the disaster hits transport infrastructure. Since we want to document that international trade is playing such an important role in propagating climate disasters to other countries. Okay, so we want to study the heterogeneity, across the disasters that hit transport infrastructures versus those that do not hit infrastructure. Okay, and we want to investigate the impact of climate disasters on the real economy, and to do that, we use a matching and stacking a difference in differences strategy. Okay, and we study, the impact of climate disasters on financial market or stock returns in main trade partners, and we take a standard financial market event study method. This method is commonly used in the finance or accounting literature. Okay, and in the last part of the paper, we study the relationship between stock market valuation measured with PE ratios and exposures to foreign long-term climate change risks. So with that, we can discuss how how should climate change risk, this long-term risk affect stock valuations in individual countries through the trade channel. Okay, so here are these the results I would like to report to you today. So what we find is first, climate disasters that affect ports, those that heat ports, significantly reduce the affected countries' imports, exports, output, and they also undermine GDP in the main international trade partners. Okay. On the other hand, the climate disasters that did not hit ports, or those that hit, the infrastructure that are less important for international trade, do not have these, negative effects on trade or on the main trade partners. Okay. And we find, climate disasters restructure supply chains. So why we call this a supply chain restructuring? We find that climate disasters disrupt trade in the downstream. So basically, if a climate disaster breaks out, the country that is affected by the disaster has a smaller export share. They have less to sell to downstream countries, right? So trade is disrupted in the downstream. But on the other hand, we also find trade is strengthened in the upstream. The countries that are hit by climate disasters increase their import shares from upstream countries. So basically, they have to rely more on inputs from upstream countries to consume or to rebuild. Okay, and we quantify the impact of trade disruptions or supply chain organization on upstream and downstream GDP using a new decomposition formula. If we have time, we can talk more about it. Okay, and we find that climate disasters have negative impact on a main international trade partner stock returns for aggregate market and tradable sectors. A stock market data is helpful in the sense that they have detailed information on the sector level. So we know the heterogeneous returns across sectors in the main trade partners. We find for most tradable sectors, their stock prices are adversely affected by foreign climate disasters in the main trade partners. But if you look at non-tradables like telecommunication, their stock returns are not affected by foreign climate disasters. Okay. And in the last part of the paper, we study, how exposures to foreign long-term climate change risk affect, asset valuations measured with PE ratio for the aggregate market and tradable sectors in the home country. So basically, similar to what we had, for the event study, right? We find exposures to these foreign climate risks reduce the stock market valuation in a home country, and in particular for the tradable sectors. Okay. So we look at the real economy. We take this event study approach. So the events we consider are 430 non-overlapping climate disasters. So for climate event or sort of a something that is related to climate to be qualified as a disaster, they have to satisfy the following standards defined by the IMF. They have to affect more than 0.5% of the country's population, or they cause a damage of greater than 0.05% of GDP. And we also keep the disasters whose event windows do not overlap. So to make sure that we have a clean pre-trend, right? And event window in this case is from 4 months before the disaster's start date to 4 months after the disaster start date. So let's say a disaster happens at time t, the event window is t minus 4 to t plus 4, right? So we keep the disasters whose windows do not overlap. Okay, and we work hard to find a clean control group. So for each climate disaster D that is hitting country ID, we find a clean control country I prime as the control group, and we require that controls are not hit by any climate disaster within the event window, and also they should be, according to propensity score matching, they should be most similar to the treatment country in terms of GDP and population. Okay. Here, right here. Okay, they have to affect more than 0.5% of population and 0.05% of GDP, and they have to be no, it's not climate related. The data source is emergency event database, MDAT. So in a sample, climate disasters include storms, hurricanes, heat waves, and drought. So these are 4 major kinds of climate disasters. I mean, we can talk about predictability later. I mean, we did a bunch of tasks for that. Okay. So here is the event study figures that show, how climate disasters affect the home macroeconomy. Okay, so I have other results, but here we focus on trade. So on the left figure, I show how climate disasters affect exports, and on the right, we show how they affect imports. Okay, and the black line shows the impact of climate disasters at heat ports. Okay, so what we did was we get the area that is affected by climate disaster on the map. Okay, and we project the locations of infrastructure on the map, and we determine if these disasters hit ports. Okay, so what you can see from the figure on the left is disasters at heat ports significantly reduced the country's exports to other countries. Whereas if you look at the disasters that did not hit ports, due to a large confidence interval, we can now conclude with confidence that they significantly reduce imports. Okay, and what is interesting from the right is the two kinds of disasters have different or the opposite effects on imports. The disasters that hit ports significantly reduce the country's imports, but those that didn't hit ports increase the country's imports. So this is related to that countries have incentive to smooth consumption, right? So production is disrupted in this country, and they want to consume, so they have to rely on foreign consumption goods or intermediate inputs. And if transport infrastructure is disrupted, I mean, they want to import more, but they could not, right? That's why we see a decrease in here. But we see that the disasters that didn't hit ports raise the country's imports from other countries. Okay, and with that, we due to such supply and demand shocks, we naturally would like to investigate how climate disasters affect other countries, in particular the main trade partners. Okay, so we first define the two sets of market shares that are important for this analysis. So the first is the share of output, defined as the ratio of country I's trade flow to country K divided by country I's output. So we both fix these numbers to time t. Okay, so we have an output share that is time varying, depends on a month of study. Okay, and the main downstream country K is the country to which the midstream country I sells the largest share of output. Okay, and in upstream we have the expenditure, which is the share of midstream countries' expenditure that is sourced from upstream countries. So again, I denotes the midstream, country J is the upstream. Okay, and the expenditure equals the trade flow from I to J divided by country I's total expenditure. Okay, and with the expenditure, we define the main upstream country. Okay, and to study how disasters affect macroeconomy in other countries, again we use a event study approach. So on the right-hand side, we interact this time dummy with the exposure measure to downstream countries. So here we consider the downstream, and we can do upstream in a similar way. So how should we think about downstream countries' exposure to the midstream disaster? So let's say a disaster causes damage ID in the midstream country due to climate disaster D. Okay, and if you think about production loss, and such production loss is split across all downstream countries, the loss in supplies from midstream country I to downstream country K will be equal to the midstream's damage multiplied by the output share. Okay, and we then divide this with the downstream country's GDP. So that's the downstream's exposure measure. It's a supply shock relative to downstream countries' GDP. Okay, and we follow the literature to control for fixed effects and standard clustering method. Okay, so in terms of control group, the control group for the downstream country is the country that is not affected by any climate disaster during the event window. They are not midstream or main downstream, and they are the main downstream of the midstream control group. Okay, so what this means is we have a midstream country that is hit by climate disaster, and it has a control group. and we find the main downstream of the country in a control group, and we exclude the countries that are directly affected by these disasters.
Sorry, can I ask a clarifying question?
Yes, please.
It seems that you divide the countries ex ante in midstream, upstream, and downstream.
Yeah,
Do you do that?
Yeah, I mean, for each disaster, we define an upstream, midstream, and downstream. Yes.
Okay.
Say that again. So I think 40%. So 430 multiplied by 40% is about 160. So so this is the figure for, I mean, upstream and downstream GDP. I think this is a pretty cool figure. So if you look at the disasters at heat ports, they significantly reduce the GDP in downstream country and in upstream country. Okay. And on the other hand, if you look at the disasters that did not hit ports, they did not significantly affect GDP in downstream and upstream countries. And we get these magnitudes by multiplying the coefficients that we identify here with the summary statistic, or the mean of the downstream's exposure matter and the upstream's exposure matter. We get these magnitudes. So on average, climate disaster reduces main downstream country GDP by 0.5% and reduces main upstream countries' GDP by 0.36% in the first month if the disaster hits ports. Okay?
Can you give a sense of could these be driven by different types of disasters hitting ports and non-ports, or these differences? Could it be driven by the types of disaster rather than the target of disaster?
So here I'm focusing on this port trade mechanism, and what you are suggesting is.
No, I'm asking. It would be nice to see maybe get some sense of whether there's similar types of disaster hitting ports, and there's others. But what I'm saying is, if there's selection on the shock here.
I see. So I think it would be helpful to control for the disaster type fixed effect, right? So we got a fixed effect for a hurricane and then a fixed effect for thunderstorm. Yes, we can do that. We haven't tried that.
Okay.
Yeah. Okay. So now we move on to discuss the impact on trade disruptions. Okay, and as I suggested before, trade is disrupted in downstream. If you look at the figure on the left, the disaster affected countries are having a small export share to downstream countries, and in particular, so for the sample of disasters that hit ports. Okay, and if you look at the figure on the right, so what we see here is the climate disasters increase. Actually, they increase the share of imports from upstream countries. So what this means is, disasters make countries rely more on foreign imports. Okay. So with this, we can do a decomposition that helps us understand the contributions of supply shock versus supply and demand shocks versus trade disruptions on GDP in downstream. Because we see an increase in the share of imports. I mean, if they rely more on domestically produced products, we will see a decrease in the. And we also see an increase in import share from main upstream countries, right? The main trade partners that we focus on, right? So this is evidence you're requesting, right? So they. Yes. Yes, I think you can put it this way. So for the disasters that hit ports, they reduce the country's imports, but to a less extent than the reduction in the country's consumption of GDP. right? So I mean, countries are definitely doing badly with climate disasters, but their supply chain is strengthened in the upstream. They rely more on upstream imports from upstream. So that's the takeaway. Okay. And with these two facts, we can do a decomposition. We decomposed the impact of disasters on downstream and upstream GDP into this supply and demand shock and trade disruptions. So let's use the downstream specification as an example. So what is a supply shock? The supply shock is measuring how disasters propagate to downstream countries according to a fixed share of output. Okay, so let's say trade is not disrupted at all. So the midstream's climate disaster is split among all downstream countries according to a fixed trade share. Okay, and we divide it with GDP. And trade openness or trade disruption measures, how the change in export share or output share affects GDP in downstream countries. And due to this literature on gains from trade, we know that if trade is disrupted in downstream, I mean, they may contribute negatively to downstream GDP or consumption. Okay, and we have a similar specification for upstream. Right, supply and demand shocks mean that the impact shocks if you hold fixed the trade shares, and trade disruption term measures the impact of changes in trade shares on downstream and upstream countries. Okay, so here is a summary of the results. We find trade is indeed disrupted in downstream, but they contribute very little to the output loss in downstream countries. So supply shock contributed 98% to the GDP loss in downstream countries, and trade openness contributes about 2%. Okay, and since supply chain is strengthened in the upstream, the demand shock contributes more than 100% to the loss in upstream GDP, whereas this strengthening in trade linkages with upstream countries reduces the negative impact on upstream GDP by about 1/3. Okay, so that's the decomposition. We can talk more about the specification later. Okay, so moving on, we look at the financial market. We use a pretty standard financial market event study approach. And again, we have the same event window as before. So the estimation window where we estimate the CAPM model runs from 12 months before the disaster started to 1 month before the disaster started. And with that, we fit this model, and that model will give us the normal return or the return on the stock market if there were no climate disasters. Okay, and we take the difference between the actual return and the normal return, and with that we get the abnormal return. That can be considered as the impact of climate disasters. And we do this accumulation that will give you the cumulative abnormal return or the total loss from climate disasters. Okay, and during the event window, which runs from 20 days from before the climate disaster started to 80 days after it, right? We get this cumulative sum. Okay, and we compute the mean and confidence interval, and that will give us the event study figures. So we see very large impact, possibly due to demand shock in upstream stock market loss. So basically, an average climate disaster reduced main upstream stock market return by 1.5%, and the impact on downstream is smaller, about 1%. But we both get significance in 4 months. Okay, and we look at cross-sector heterogeneity. We see a significant decrease in the stock returns in the tradable sectors, for example, chemical and automobile sectors, due to foreign climate disasters. But we don't see any effect in these service sectors like telecommunication, finance. I mean, they don't show anything, as a response to foreign climate disasters. Okay, and in the next step, we do a cross-disaster, analysis. We regress the cumulative abnormal return or the total loss from foreign climate disasters on the upstream and downstream exposure measures that we constructed before. Okay, and what we show in this table is that exposure to foreign climate disasters indeed reduce stock market valuations or stock market returns in the home country. And this result is robust to different, clustering of standard errors and fixed effect controls. Okay, and we interact exposure measure with sector tradability, and we consider a pool regression of all sectors. And once we introduce this interaction term, the level effect becomes insignificant. What this means is, the negative impact is concentrated in the tradable sector. So we consider two alternative definitions for sector tradability. So one is a dummy that equals 1 if a sector is tradable sector, and the other is the sector tradability measure defined in the previous slide, which equals the sector's total trade divided by the sector's world GDP. Okay, so we get once we introduce the interaction term, the level effect becomes insignificant, right? So that's takeaway number 1, and takeaway number 2 is we look at the two samples, heat import and those that did not heat ports. Okay, we see very large impacts for the sample of disasters that heat ports on the tradable sectors, where we don't see anything on this sample. Okay, and in the end, we investigate the associations between exposures to foreign long-term climate change risk and domestic stock markets asset valuation, a measure with P/E ratio. Okay, and we construct upstream and downstream exposure measures like before, and we run correlations. Okay, so we see exposure to foreign climate risk is negatively associated with stock market valuations in the home country. And again, if we introduce this interaction term, level effect becomes insignificant. Okay, and we did a bunch of placebo tests. We show it is not driven by openness to trade, trading with large countries or countries that have faster economic growth. Okay, so with that we conclude. So what we find is in this paper is climate shocks that happen to any country in the global supply chain can significantly affect macro financial performances in other countries. That's why we are all in the same boat. Countries who work together to build climate resilience in other countries. Okay, thank you very much.
So I think Shafat already asked this question on the climate disaster. So if you say climate disaster, is it kind of all disasters related to the climate or a specific one?
So I responded to this question. So we consider 4 types of climate disasters. There are hurricanes, floods, storms, and heat waves, or maybe more. So basically, they first need to be a climate event, something related to climate. So earthquake is not climate event, right? And then they have to be big, like they have to satisfy specific standards, defined by the IMF.
But did you have a criteria for choosing the kind of climate, the disasters that you chose? Did you come up with a criteria?
I mean, it is in a paper. I think I made the point clear, right? First, it has to be a climate-related event, and second, it has to be big, right? For the specific definition, I mean, it's we don't have.
What kind of data did you use for the climate disaster?
So it's called EMDAT, Emergency Events Database.
Hi, Lawrence. I'll refrain from using the climate and disaster in the same sentence and next to each other. Maybe you can use the term climate-related disaster and disaster risk reduction, especially exactly.
Oh.
And can use climate-induced disasters, but still you cannot. It's impossible technically in any way to connect climate change with any single disaster. So it's good for you can use the term hydrometeorological disaster or something, or in context of Asia or Southeast Asia, you can use, because here I think floods is number 1 and tropical cyclone, so better term. I don't think MDAT has any data, any climate disaster term. I'm sure it's the Belgian database, right? That we are using. The Belgian based, yeah. I don't use the term climate.
Yeah.
But you are refraining also from the events that can have, because climate-related disaster or climate-induced can be a drought. Or there are other events which are slow onset disasters. And for those, no damage or loss is assessed because it's not an emergency. So maybe you are referring to those disasters that have a quick onset. They can cause sudden disruption of. In case of Asia, you're not limiting yourself. It's okay because floods and the tropical cyclones, but in other countries can be like I don't know, Japan. It was tsunami plus earthquake plus tsunami. So typically they have also cascading events. So you cannot just take one single event.
Yeah, I mean,
well.
so we did the following robustness test, so if that helps. So we consider, you know, a detrending and seasonalizing or whatever it is called. So we take out the regular components in the disaster damages of the disasters that we consider. So in a way that we filter out, you know, the regular part of these climate events. And I mean, that's one of the robustness tests that we did. And on top of that, we also consider, I mean, different kinds of robustness tests. For example, detrending the outcome variable, detrending the GDP. Right? Is this something you are looking for, or I mean, you're speaking from the back. I can't really get your point. Yeah, go ahead.
No, I'm just saying that also the database, they do not connect events. They are only the last 30 years, and they take only those events which have a big impact. So they take either in number of deaths or that are damage and loss assessments, which is a common methodology World Bank and UN uses for assessing events. So maybe you are limiting yourself, and if you focus only on those climate events, it's general terms, maybe the robustness of your findings is not so.
I mean, we use that to help identification, right? So you can always, you know, expand the sample, but I mean, I don't know. I think, you know, what we identify here is robust. Okay. Yes.
It's like after 4 months, it's still elevated.
Yeah.
Right. So you have a potential confound. You may need to scrub it a bit.
Yeah. Right. That's a good point. Yeah, we only focus on the 4 months.
Yeah, but then in your event studies, it shows that after 4 months, they're still elevated. Or
yeah, we can try revise this test.
Sounds very interesting. Thank you. And so I was screwing my mind on this. So you find that stock market, both upstream and downstream go down, right?
Yeah.
GDP, both upstream and downstream go down. But then on the trade results, you have the thing that, you know, upstream countries are stronger, right? So the logic of what might be driving these both declining GDP and the stock market on the upstream country is still to be explored, right? From what you're saying.
So
mechanism.
yeah, that's a good one. So I mean, my response would be this is a decomposition, right? So what these tables show you is you know, this reorganization of supply chain reduces the effect on upstream countries. It is really not telling you like what the benchmark be. Maybe the demand effect is just, you know, stronger than the supply effect. Yeah, I don't know. I think I should explore that.
And the other question more general was, it seems that you have very detailed data to say whether one port is affected or not. But if you think about the US, now, so there's a disaster hitting Louisiana or you know, Texas, right? And then because it's a port, you know, you say that it affects, and then if it's in Miami, there is not a port, and so it doesn't affect. That's how you do it. It's a question of clarification. Because if you think about these big countries, you know, like US, India, China, maybe even a sub-regional dimension would be more appropriate if you want to.
Yeah. So what we did was, you know, we have a world map. We match climate disasters to the area that they affect. You can see they are denoted with these red circles. They're not really like, you know, if US is heat, you know, we pilot the whole US as red. So we match the emergency events database with a recent database from Columbia University. So they have very detailed information about the geographical scope of these disasters, and we match those pictures.
And for each disaster, then you go upstream and downstream. That's what you're doing. So midstream is what you define to be the center of the disaster, and then you go upstream and downstream from there.
Exactly.
Okay, now I understand.
Sorry. Yeah.
Also?
I've got a couple of questions. One of them is I'm wondering if the climate events you have here are satisfying strict or some kind of weak exogeneity. One thing that we know that happens during these kind of events is the government consumption goes up. The government steps in and the government spending is going to go up. Whether that's going to be completely correlated with these climate things. and whether that introduces any bias in those estimates in terms of their causal effects. That might be even more important given that one of the selection criteria for the climate event was if the effect on GDP was of some magnitude, right? So if the government really steps in and doesn't allow the GDP to go down as much, no matter how big the event is or how big the effects are on other sectors, the overall GDP might not have gone down as much. The final thing about the anticipation effect, especially in those financial markets event studies, the financial markets are much faster incorporating those anticipation effects.
Exactly. I mean, these are fascinating questions. So, we identified the total effects of climate disasters, so that includes everything, including responses in the private sector as well as the public sector. And presumably, public sector will have offsetting effects on disasters, right? But we still identify an overall negative effect. So if you take out the government, if the government didn't do anything, presumably the impact would be even larger, right? And I also include these the analysis on other macroeconomic variables. This is consumption, right? Private consumption also decreases in downstream and upstream. Sorry, there's a typo. This should be midstream and downstream and upstream. So this is a better measure for the private sector. Okay, and regarding the anticipation effect, I mean that's exactly why we want to fix the starting point of the event window to 1 month before the climate disaster, because there are like better forecasted kind of stuff, right? So we want to use that to sort of control for the anticipation effect. Also, we did pre-trend analysis. Most of the figures do not have a pre-trend. I mean some little bit of that, but if you look at this upstream figure, I mean, there's no significant pre-trend, right? And similar for the figures for the real economy, right? So I think we can do more robustness tests to improve. Yeah. I mean, that's a good point. Yes. Yeah, we didn't do it in this paper, but we are actually thinking about how we should incorporate these empirical findings into a model, a framework that can better understand the questions that you suggested. Of course, we can do some accounting exercise, but yeah, this is a good point. Yes. I mean, in the end, I hope we can put this the findings here into policy. So.
Yeah, just a quick one. So for small countries, okay, so does your findings imply that for small countries, is it more imperative to have the adaptation measures like upgrading infrastructure like ports, roads, and so on, rather than with the limited resources, rather than involve themselves in reducing carbon emission initiatives, because a small countries doesn't, even if it eliminates carbon, it doesn't, make a dent in the emission anyway.
I mean, so, yeah, exactly. I mean, that's the story we are trying to push. So for emerging market countries, small island economies, it might be more helpful, if you think about their roles in the global value chain for other countries to help them build adaptation. So I think this table sort of speaks to your question. I'm sorry, this is a very small letters here. So what we find here in column 2 and column 4 is that emerging market economies are more vulnerable to foreign climate disasters. So we interact the exposure measure with whether the upstream and downstream country is an emerging market economy. We do get a significant sign here. So what this seems to suggest is emerging countries are less able to adapt to foreign climate disasters, probably because they have bad infrastructure, they cannot easily switch suppliers and customers, right? But if you look at, if the midstream country, the country affected by climate disaster, is an emerging market, we don't see any difference here. So probably, emerging market economies are indeed more vulnerable, but as a trade partner, I think we can do more analysis related to, small economies.
Okay, thank you. So yeah, we'll move on to, thank you very much for your presentation.
Thank
We'll
you.
now move on to the next event.
We're here.
Okay, thanks everyone for having me here. It's actually a pleasure to be in the other side of the world. I'm from Colombia, so it was a long trip to be here. The usual disclaimer, I'm from the central bank, so these are my views and the views of my author, not necessarily the views of the Central Bank of Colombia. So what I'm going to do in these next couple of minutes is to talk about how foreign climate policy from the rest of the world affects a small open economy like Colombia, and if there is a space for Colombia to do something to avoid basically the negative effects of the policy in the rest of the world. As they were saying over there, back there, what we do in terms of climate change is, as a small open economy, is not going to have a huge impact on climate change. However, the policies of the rest of the world, they are going to have impacts on the small open economy, especially in an economy like Colombia, that we export basically commodities and carbon intensive goods. So the motivation from here is that basically what we know in terms of climate policy is that most of the climate policy that is going to be taken over the next couple of years is going to be most likely to be unilateral trade policy, unilateral policy. It's really difficult to get a lot of cooperation in terms of the countries. So what we are going to keep seeing is that countries unilateral, they are going just to be taking policies on their own. Usually what we have seen is that there are a couple of options for climate policy. One is to keep raising taxes on carbon goods, on the production of carbon intensive goods. But if countries keep doing this, they are going to basically face a lot of, oh God, I was getting used to this. They are going to get a lot of challenges in terms of the domestic industry. So if they keep raising domestic taxes or domestic taxes, they are going just to keep losing competitiveness in some domestic industries, and they can generate a lot of carbon leakage. So basically, production can go somewhere else, and this is something that they really don't want. So there is a lot of attention on what is called now the border carbon adjustment, or BCAs, which is a complement to pricing on domestic production. The way this basically works is kind of an import tariff. So we are going just to increase the tariff to the goods that they use a lot of carbon in a sense. This is actually better for the domestic industry, because it's going just to basically level the playing field of domestic industry that are already paying taxes with imports that they don't pay those taxes. So of course there are going just to be some considerations in the implementing economy. So if we think an economy that is put in a VC, that is going just to have basically some results or some effects on domestic industry. But right now this is not our concern. Basically what we want to understand is what is going to happen in the other economies where I put the tariff. And especially what we want to see is what is going to happen in an economy like Colombia, which we cannot do much in that sense. So what we want to do is two things. So first, to understand what is going to be the effect of this increasing tariff on the domestic industry. And the second one, if there is a policy response that we can do basically just to try to reduce the negative effects of this foreign policy. So what we're going to do is we're going to adopt the perspective of a small open economy like Colombia that is facing some increases in BCAs by the foreign partners. What we are going to analyze in these papers is basically we're going to focus on the effects on this domestic economy. And basically, we are not going to take any considerations of climate change. So we want just to see what is the effect of the policy. And we are going to see what the policy generates. And what we are going to use, the tool that we are going to use is a model with trade adjustment dynamics. We're going just to have a model with full dynamics. So we are not only compared within steady states, but we want to see also the transitional effects of the policy since the announcement. So the idea here is that today we know that in the future, maybe in 5 or 10 years from now, things are going to be more difficult. So we want to know if it makes sense to start doing something today, or we just wait until the policy is implemented. And then we can see what are going to affect right now, the transition, and in the steady state. And this is going to be really important for the long run and short run response. So this is related with a bunch of literature. I just want to say mostly of the literature for these policies is for big economies, for developed economies. And they usually what they do is just to compare between the steady states. So there are two contributions from this paper. One is that we are going to focus on the perspective of a small open economy like Colombia. And the second one is that we are going to use all of the analysis for the transition dynamic. So the setup here, we said a lot that is a small open economy, but it's not a small open economy model. It's actually a multi-country model. But we are going to take this perspective of a small unit in that economy. We are going to model three economies. Two of them are going to be big. We're going to have two rest of the world. One is going to be a climate conscious coalition. You can think about Europe. It's a climate conscious coalition. And we are going to have the small open economy that is going to be Colombia. And then we are going to have another rest of the world, which is going to be the one that is not going to implement any climate policy. We're going to have 4 layers of production. So on the top layer, we are going to produce final goods that basically are going just to use for consumption and investment. And to produce these final goods, we are going to use basically intermediate from 2 sectors here. One is going to be a clean sector, and the other is going to be a dirty sector that basically uses energy intensively. To produce goods in each sector, we are going just to use basically a combination of sector-specific inputs. So basically to produce the goods for the clean sector, I'm going to use domestic clean goods and imported clean goods that they come from the rest of the world 1 and from the rest of the world 2, and the same for the dirty goods. The difference between these two is that basically to produce dirty goods or from the dirty sector, we are going to use more energy than to produce for the clean good. And to produce each of the inputs, we are going to use a quite standard production function with labor, materials, sector-specific capital, and fossil energy. We are going just to have some endowment for commodities, and we are also going to produce energy with
clean energy.
What was that?
You don't have clean energy, green energy.
No, we do have just changes in the intensity in which we use each of those. But yeah, we can adapt. Yeah. Because the one that is going to use the difference between clean and dirty is how intensively they use the fossil fuel. Yeah, that's basically. I think with this is going to be a little bit more clear the structure of the economy. So this is kind of the picture for a particular country. So we are going to have some households. These households, they are going to have, the country is going to have an endowment. Basically, we can say this is oil or raw materials. And they are going to have an endowment of labor. This endowment of labor and the endowment of the raw material is going to help me to track the size or the relative size of the countries. This is going to be kind of a target in the calibration. Then we're going to produce fossil energy. To produce fossil energy, we are going to use all of the endowment of the commodity. We are going to use some labor and some specific capital for this sector. These sector-specific capitals are going to be quite important for the transition, because once you have a shock in one sector, then you cannot move immediately capital to another sector. So you are going to have some adjustment in there. Then what we are going to do is we are going to have 2 big sectors in this economy. One sector which is going to be basically kind of the clean sector, and the other sector is going to be the dirty sector. The difference is, again, how intensively they use these fossil fuels. So this sector is going to be the one that uses those fossil fuels more intensively. And well, the production structure is going to be, we're going to have a set of heterogeneous firms that they are going to produce domestic inputs that they are going to be used for production of intermediate goods that are going to be sector specific, and those sector specific intermediate goods, then we are going just to combine to produce investment and consumption. And these heterogeneous firms, they can not only produce for the domestic market, but they can also produce for the foreign market. And here is where we are going just to have basically the BCA acting as a way of a tariff. So basically a shock is going to come through here. That is kind of the basic structure of the model. I'm going just to show you a couple of equations because I think these are kind of the important equations of the model, and I'm going just to give you a glimpse of where the dynamics is coming from. But the way we produce in each sector, clean and dirty, what we are going to do is to aggregate the domestic production of intermediate goods. We are going to have a set of heterogeneous firms that they differ on productivity and on the exporting status. So basically here we're going to have a firm can have basically three states. They are not exporters, they can be a new exporter, or they can be an old exporter. The idea of this difference is just to capture a little bit of the slow adjustment into exporting market. And we are going just to have that to produce the basically the clean or the dirty input. We're going to combine domestic, yeah.
So your tax on the carbon content of your exports, right?
Yes.
And that also depends on your own fossil fuels, but also on fossil fuel embedded in imported inputs.
Yes.
Will we see any reallocation to cleaner exports?
Yes, that's basically you're going to see the results. What happens once you put the policy, you're going to see a lot of reallocation in the economy. Yeah. And here is where the tax is going to come from. Basically, it's just in the imported of clean or dirty input. Okay. So where is the dynamics of the model coming from? It's actually coming from many sides. One is from the presence of capital. So we have capital accumulation, so that is going just to have us a little bit of dynamics in the model. But the other there is that we have a lot of firm decisions into this model. So the first one is that these firms are going to pay different fixed costs. The first cost that they are going to pay is an entry cost. So the only way they are going to pay it is if the expected value of entry is positive. Once they pay that fixed cost, they are going to have a productivity draw that comes from a Pareto distribution. That's the one that we have in the morning. And once they observe the productivity, they decide if they produce or not. So given the demand, they pay a fixed production cost, they maximize profits, and then at the end of the period, we have an exogenous exit in the model. If the firm survives, they play this game again in the next period. And this is regarding basically the production for the domestic market. All of these firms, they act in monopolistic competition. That's the only sense we can have all of this, and they are heterogeneous. Basically, they are producing a specific good. For the export decision, we are going to have a couple of costs here. So we are going to have a fixed exporting cost, which is going to be different for new exporters and for all exporters. So the idea here is that basically new exporters are smaller. That comes from the data. And all exporters, well, they are bigger. They have a higher exporter premium. They face some fixed costs, some iceberg costs to sell abroad, and they also have to pay some tariffs. And basically, given this cost and the foreign demand, they decide if they pay the cost or not. So, and we also assume that a new firm that enters the market, they cannot export in the first period. So the only way if they export is that if they at least survive one period. And that's basically the whole dynamics. In terms of the production of each particular sector, what we have is, so to produce a unit of one particular good, we're going to have an individual productivity. And we are going here just to have a combination of a Cobb-Douglas production function that uses capital, labor, and materials. These materials are going to be sector specific. So for the clean sector, we combine clean and dirty, and the same for the dirty sector. And we are going just to combine this Cobb-Douglas factor with energy that comes from GVC And to produce DC, we use basically a production function like this. And that's basically the important parts of the model. I don't want just to get you bored with that. What we are going to do is to calibrate this model and analyze the effects of what if the rest of the world imposes a BCA to all of its trading partners. So basically, the rest of the world, Europe, is imposing a BCA not only to Colombia, because actually that's ridiculous, but to Colombia and the rest of the world too. Okay, and we are going to analyze those effects. And we are going to do 2 policy exercises. So the first is just to analyze what happens with the BCA by itself. The second is like, okay, what if Colombia starts doing something? What if Colombia starts putting some domestic policy to try to reduce the production in the dirty sector? And we are going to use 2 exercises. What if Colombia does by itself, unconditional of what the rest of the world does? And the second one is that, okay, what if the rest of the world compensates me for doing that policy? And we want to see what happens in the 2 cases. So this is how we are going to calibrate the model. So we are going to use a Colombian data, which we have really nice data for the manufacturing census. We are going to, the first thing is that we are going to reclassify the sectors into the dirty and clean. This is according to the high-risk carbon leakage from the European Union. The main data sources are going to be the manufacturing census for 2019, the input-output metrics for 2010. We are going just to calibrate for each sector some sector-specific moments that are going just to talk about the iceberg cost and the fixed cost in the model. So we can identify each these 5 parameters with 5 specific sectors. We are going just to basically target trade openness, the fraction of new and all exporters, the sales premium, and the share of exports of the new exporters. And we are going to assume Cobb-Douglas production functions in other parts of the model so that we can use basically the input-output matrix exactly. And this is basically the policies that we are going just to implement here. So the first one is that the Climate Conscious Coalition is going to announce a tariff increase of 50% on the dairy sector in 10 years. So it's telling today that in 10 years, we are going to increase the tariff. And we want to see the response of that. And then we are going to compare this with the policy response of the small open economy. What if the small open economy, what does is to increase the tariffs on the usage of oil, of energy. And we are going to see what happens in 2 cases when we have unconditional or conditional policy. So this is what happens in the small open economy after. So here is the announcement. This is period 0. The line is just the initial steady state. And this is going to be implemented basically in kind of around year 10. Yes, go on.
Yeah, I lost the size of the shock is
50%. So
of the baseline. So
on the baseline.
If 1%, if it's 2%, it's 1%.
Well, yes, but so the baseline here is kind of, if I am not wrong, we are moving this from 10% to 20% or something like that.
To 15. Okay.
Yes.
Okay.
Yes. Yes. Yeah. So if taxes are 10% in the baseline scenario, they jump up to 20%. Okay. Yeah.
These are on the carbon content, right?
Yeah.
So it's endogenous.
For the shock we are doing here, we are assuming exactly the size of the shock. We are trying to do some other exercises in which basically what we do is that the rest of the world one, they already have some carbon taxes initially. But Colombia, let's say they have 0 carbon taxes. So the initial shock somehow we are also trying to calibrate so that the cost of using energy in the 2 kind of levels up. But that is not exactly this exercise. So for this one, we are assuming we are increasing tariffs from 10% to 20%. And this is basically a shock. Yes.
So quick question. So I thought the results would depend on the relative size of the green conscious and the non-green conscious. And
yes.
So, for example, you can get an equilibrium where the green conscious withdraws, but there's complete switching to the non-green conscious world. So you can conceive of a model where you have no effect at all. How come you get unambiguous results?
So what is happening here is that basically the rest of the world one is increasing tariffs for everyone, not only for the small open economy, but also for the rest of the world too. So in that
open
case,
economy can export to the rest of the world.
Yes, but given that the rest of the world too is also paying more taxes to import to export to the rest of the world. One, there is a demand shock. So actually, if we decompose this, I don't have it here, but if we decompose these shocks into what is just the effect of increasing tariffs to a small open economy, and anyone else, the effects are actually really small, because in that case, the small open economy just exports everything to the rest of the world too. But given that the rest of the world too is also affected by the tariff, in that case, there is not that much reallocation. So most of the effect actually here is coming just from the drop in the demand, in the global demand due to the policy. Yeah. So we have here, so actually the effects here is kind of, I'm going just to show you some numbers in a bit, but we have a drop in consumption that actually the drop is bigger in the short run, kind of in the transition, than in the new steady state. And we have a lot of adjustment here. We see a drop in gross output, a huge drop in exports. We are increasing here a 50% kind of the distortion in the sector that we export the most, the commodity sector. But what is interesting is that we see a lot of reallocation in the sectors. So this is the sector. The blue one is basically a clean sector. The red is the dirty sector. So we have a lot of reallocation in the economy. It takes some time to reallocate resources between one sector and the other. But actually, this reallocation basically generates that the drop in consumption in welfare is not that big in a sense. These are the results. What if if Colombia, on top of the VCA, it does domestic policy that punishes the usage of dirty energy? Well, this is basically adding up the distortions in the economy. So if Colombia puts this policy and is not compensated for doing this, we are actually worse off in every sense, which makes sense. But what if we are a little bit compensated by the policy? So what if this is kind of a 50% compensation? So Colombia increases the taxes for using fossil fuels, and then now the rest of the world doesn't increase to 50, but increase just 20%. So in that case, a compensation policy actually makes things better in terms of welfare. We have fewer reallocation of resources in the economy, which kind of makes sense because the shock is a little bit smaller. In terms of numbers, this is kind of the welfare calculation with respect to the initial steady state. And here it is interesting just to see what are the dynamic versus the static effects. So the initial policy, which is the VCA, we see kind of we compare between two steady states. The drop in welfare is around 1.6%. In the dynamic case is 1.48. This is because the first period's consumption is not falling that much, and they matter a little bit more for welfare. And we have more welfare losses when we have the unconditional policy, and fewer welfare losses when we don't have the unconditional policy. Here we just combine it, like what if we have different unconditional or conditional policies.
So just one quick question.
Yes.
So you can, I'm interested in the scenario where you can suffer the border cost adjustment versus situation where you go clean yourself.
Yeah.
And then you avert the border cost
yes.
tax at destination market. What is the answer there? Is it welfare? Is it better to go green on your own economy wide, or to suffer the consequences of a border cost adjustment?
So if you are compensated for that,
no, forget about compensation. The two choices: either you are forced, or you do it yourself to avoid. So between a domestic carbon price versus a border tax,
is going to depend a lot on how avoiding that is going to be. So basically, if I just do the policy by myself.
So what are you assuming about the conditional? How clean do you have to be to avoid the border tax? Let's say you make some assumption about
yes.
that. Is that you're saying that relationship?
Yes.
But supposing you have the EU threshold for cleanliness,
yeah.
which would avert the border tax completely.
Yes, in that case, we have, it's going to depend a lot on what is the comparison, in how much they are going to increase the tax versus how much that costs me. So depending on how we define that, it could be a scenario in which it's much better to clean yourself to avoid the the tax. But it's going to depend a lot on how they are designing the policy. So, and we are working a lot on that, just to try to use really well the data. Just for instance, to say how much should be the increase in taxes from the rest of the world or on the BCA to get this. But yeah, we are working on that, and we have some scenarios in which that can happen exactly. That it's better to clean yourself, but it depends a lot on the design. Yeah. Yes. Yes, and I think that's why. Yeah, that's why kind of in the production function we are for the part that we use the energy, we are trying to not to use a Cobb-Douglas production function, that we can basically use all of these substitution effects when you try to move away from the dirty technology. So in that case, it's going to depend a lot on the parameters. Right now in the model, it's going to depend a lot on the parameters that we are using. I think this is all. So we are already kind of in the discussion. Yeah. Yes, yes, yes. From the census data, we can do that. Yes, yes, exactly. Yes, yes, and actually that's kind of what happens in the model. We see a lot of reallocation to those firms that they don't use this intensively. Yes, yeah, in the data we can actually have way more. Right now in the model we just have for convenience two sectors, but we can go at least once we have some nice results, we can even go a little bit more dispersed into that. And actually in another project with George Alessandra, we have more split sectors into that. Yes, yes, it's only yes, yes. So here the BCA is just to all of the sectors that somehow they use in energy more intensive. We are not basically using the dispersion of that. That can be also nice because yeah. Right now, yes. Right now, yes. We are working in something in which also the BCA adjusted endogenously in how much we are using the fossil energy. So we are trying to do that calculation. That is even better. It's like when we endogenize really and make the increase in the BCA depending on how much we are using energy, that give us some really nice results. But we are kind of working on that.
Okay, so we'll open up the floor. I mean, it's already open. To questions. Well, let me use the time I have to just ask my question. So two questions actually. First is about what happens to the usage of fossil fuels in these different scenarios that you did. Are you equating that? So how are you looking at the scenario? So compensation versus no compensation, domestic versus foreign, carbon adjustment penalties, or carbon penalties. Are you equating the fossil fuel reduction?
We are not grading that, but of course, like in all of the scenarios, we see a drop in the usage of fossil fuel.
But that could be another metric to look at how
Yes,
achieve
yes.
bigger.
That for the policy design,
Yeah.
we are kind of trying to do what is the best. What is the best? If we make the policy basically response to how much we are using the fossil fuels or not. But yeah.
And secondly, how again your point about relevance or dynamics? Could you just explain the transition? How that I know that gives us a bigger sense of the transition, but in terms of results, welfare results, how will it change?
So basically, well, one we just compare the two steady states. We are not seeing all of this drop or anticipation before the actual policy. So this gives us a sense of if it is important to do something today or not, and also to play around with the timing on when to do the policy. So here, what we are doing is that the BCA is announced to be in 10 years, but if the economy does something, it starts doing it right now. And in that case, it gave us like some nice results in which doing something today is much better than just to wait 10 years, because all of this takes time, like in terms of investment, in terms of the access for the export market. So that's what all of the trade dynamics give us in this case, is that it matters to start doing something today. If we just wait 10 years, it's worse, actually. We haven't played with the when. Right now, we just have the start now or start in 10 years. But we can also, we have played around also, what if the European Union announces to do this in 10 years, but it suddenly does it in 5 years instead of, what if they just move the calendar? We have seen things like that.
They never do it.
That is also yeah, that's another thing that we are trying to do, is just playing around with the uncertainty.
But just one quick thing, sorry to interrupt, but I was going to say, the when one depends on fixed costs, how quickly things depreciate, whether you're, risk of stranded assets or not. Another is Daria's question of how quickly you expect cheaper technologies to emerge. And
Yes,
the third twist is, and this is the argument people make, that that there's scope for learning by doing in green technologies, that there are nice papers which show the cost curves. So you can't look at the cost curves as a static comparison. If you switch to green today, your costs are likely to be lower tomorrow if you work with it. So I think it's a very nice question you're asking, but I think this question of sunk costs or the pace of depreciation, the emergence of new technologies, and the cost reduction by using technologies might be things that you at least want to think about.
Yeah, in that case, I think we need to change a little bit the setup to basically have some trends into the model in terms of like growth in the productivity of the clean sector. We haven't considered that. I think that is an interesting thing to do, is to have some trends into these models.
Sorry, I'm pretty sure it's my own problem. So what is the conditional tariff adjustment? Can you?
The conditional tariff adjustment. Yeah. So we have the first is that we just have the BCA. The other is the conditional policy. So if Colombia does some domestic policy, what if it does it regardless what the rest of the world does? That is the unconditional one. So basically, we are adding just two frictions into the economy: the BCA plus the domestic policy. And the conditional one is that if I do the domestic policy, they reduce a little bit the BCA. That's
specific.
Yeah. Yeah, in that case, we are kind of playing around a lot with the design of the.
One question here.
Yep.
This is Fabian Vera. Very nice presentation. When you mention the relevance of the dynamics, you are also trying to see the responses and the graduality in the responses. Have you tried using the derivative?
What was that?
Have you tried using the derivative?
No, we haven't. No, we haven't. And yeah, of course, the speed kind of the adjustment is the closer you get to the date of the actual implementation, the stronger the response of the economy. So like in the first years, the economy responds, but not too strongly. It responds mostly on investment and on the export market, not that much in consumption.
Yeah, the background of the question is because in engineering, when you do pressure transient testing, you use the first derivative or the second derivative to find how the responses are in log times or semi-log times.
Yeah, no, that would be an interesting metric
to
introduce. Yeah, thank you. Okay.
So thank you very much. We'll move on to our next presenter.
Reyes? What is this?
Okay, thank you for having me today. Today I will present trade policy uncertainty, offshoring, and the environment. So this is joint work with Karim, University of Hawaii, Jay at HEC Montreal, and Guyon at UC Santa Cruz, and me, National Taiwan University. So the pattern that has been documented pretty much well-known pattern is that there is a global divergence in pollution emissions between high-income countries and low-income countries. It appears that high-income countries tend to produce less pollutants, and developing economies tend to produce more pollutants. And this is cross-sectional. However, if we look at the trend, this pattern is even more stark. So in the late 20th century and in the 21st century, developing economies like China and India, their emission has been growing pretty fast. Whereas, to the contrary, the emissions from developed economies has been going down. So this has been documented, but there are many theories why this is the case. And then concurrently, while this is happening, what is also happening concurrently in this world economy is, of course, global integration. Now it's easier to access imported intermediate goods, and then we now have better offshoring opportunities. And also, China has expanded to the international market. So on the one side, there is this global divergence in emission patterns between developed economy and developing economies. And on the other hand, there is this global integration and expansion of offshoring. So we start to wonder, is there any connection between these two? Our argument is that there is. And the hypothesis that explains both of these patterns is pollution offshoring hypothesis. And then what it says is that progress toward trade liberalization leads to relocation of high polluting activities from developed to developing countries with laxer environmental regulations. And there is ample discussion in policy circle and media, but in the literature, economics literature, there's limited causal evidence. And also, in this literature, which tries to test pollution offshoring hypothesis, the important aspect that is missing in our opinion is that offshoring is an investment decision. Of course it is. And then it involves a lot of upfront cost. And then also we know from the literature on trade policy uncertainty that trade volume responds very sensitively to trade uncertainty. So we believe that it's useful to use some shocks to trade policy uncertainty to test offshoring, pollution offshoring hypothesis. And that's what we do. In this paper, we study long-run environmental consequences of trade liberalization, which reduce trade policy uncertainty in the US, and then its impact on US manufacturing, and explore mechanisms through which firms adjust in environmental margins. And a priori, the direction of change is ambiguous, right? When an import competition is more intense, it might be the case that the US firms now they need to compete with Chinese companies which are located in a laxer environmental regulation, so they might have to even emit more pollution. That's one possibility. The other possibility is that, as is well documented, US manufacturing employment goes down, the share of manufacturing employment goes down because of import competition from China, and therefore emission probably goes down. And another possibility is that, and perhaps because of offshoring, the emission also goes down. So there are possibilities that go to the opposite direction. So it's not quite clear which direction will dominate. So what we do is using changes in U.S. trade policy with China, which granted permanent normal trade relations in 2001, as a shock, we find that there has been a significant and persistent within establishment declines in pollution emissions. We emphasize within the establishment. So you might think that it is pretty obvious that emission would have been going down because of import competition, because manufacturing, U.S. manufacturing has been going down. But that is not what we find. It is not because the emission, U.S. emission goes down, not because manufacturing size goes down in the U.S. Also, it's not because of exit of establishments. It's because, primarily because, continuing establishments now emit less pollutions than before. And also, we show that this impact is more pronounced for establishments that face tougher environmental regulations. So therefore, it's additional evidence in support for pollution offshoring hypothesis. And then also, this impact is stronger for establishments that operate in upstream industries. And then also those which have within firm global sourcing networks. So all of these patterns are inconsistent with the pollution offshoring hypothesis. And further support for pollution offshoring hypothesis is that it appears that there is a tendency of those U.S. firms which produce dirty products to relocate their subsidiaries to China. And also at the product level regression, we find that the share of imports from China grows even more in dirty products. So all of this is inconsistent with the pollution offshore. Yes. Hoarding products constant. Mm. Mm-hmm. Mm. Yeah. Yeah, that's a likely plausible explanation, we'd say. So we do not have data on what products are being produced in Chinese subsidiaries. We don't have that data. But however, the channel that you just described is a plausible explanation. Yeah, so our work is related to the cleanup of the U.S. manufacturing literature. So it has been well documented that U.S. manufacturing has been becoming cleaner, and there are many studies about that. And we are pointing out that international trade, especially import competition from China, appears to be largely responsible for that. And then there's also literature on trade and environment, and also literature on pollution offshoring hypothesis. But to the best of our knowledge, this literature has not paid too much attention to the trade policy uncertainty aspect of pollution offshoring hypothesis. And also, we can contribute to the this China shock literature. Oh. So the data we use is toxic release inventory data, which provides U.S. facility level data, and it has information about for each chemical, the pollutant chemical. This data report the amount of emission from each U.S. facility that has more than 10 employees. And then also it provides pollution prevention efforts that each facility invested in. And then they also provide a breakdown of the total pollution waste So release here, this is the primary focus in our paper. But this data also has information about waste management. So the amount of recycling, the amount of treatment, the amount of energy recovery. So this provides these rich set of information about what each facility can need when it comes to production waste. And then, but however, one problem is that in this data, the reporting threshold for each chemical has been changing over time for many chemicals, and the list of the chemicals that it requires to report also has been changing. So we focus on those chemicals that are constant in this respect. And also we primarily focus on the chemicals that are mapped into particular matters. The other data that we use is National Establishment Time Series data, which covers a near universe of U.S. establishments from 1990 to 2020. And good thing is that both NETS data and TRI data have the same establishment identifier, DUNS number. So it is a merge. And this data has establishment characteristics like employment, sales, and industrial location, and trade status for each year for each establishment. And so we use this matched data. We focus on 1997 to 2017 because this is the year that provides the constant group of chemicals. And then also the other data that we use is WRDS. This will be studied. This will be used when we study the mechanism. So this data contains subsidiary information of U.S. public firms, and using this data, we show that there was a tendency of U.S. firms building subsidiary in China, especially among those U.S. firms which produce third products. And then we also use international trade data at HES 10-digit level. We show that later. Dirty products seem to have experienced a bigger increase in the share of imports from China. So let me first show you some stylized facts. First, using the methods from Melitz and Planek, we'll decompose the total emission decrease. So here in fact 2, number 4, the lowest one, the number 4 line, the lowest line, is the total impact, the total emission decrease in the US. So it has been decreasing. But however, if we isolate the impact from the scale effect, which is a declining manufacturing size, that doesn't really explain the declining emission. Also, even if we also add upon composition effect, that also doesn't explain that much. It explains very little. But what explains this pattern primarily is from surviving establishments. Those surviving establishments from 1997 to 2017. Also, entry and exit margin does not explain that much. It explains very little. So that what that means is that US manufacturing establishments shutting down does not really explain that much fraction of the declining emissions in the US. And also, what's surprising here is that this decrease.
Actually, can I ask? I don't know. Maybe everybody else understood. I didn't understand the last chart. So, the previous chart. Sorry. So, what is the punchline here? That the big deductions driven by.
The punchline here is that the gap between number 2 and number 3 is the biggest. That is the main point.
And that
is the surviving establishments.
So, I'm just thinking of the surviving establishments.
Surviving establishments mean those establishments which have existed from this year to this year. Those who exist throughout.
And we don't observe the ones that exited.
Yeah, so So exiters will be included in number 4.
But exit doesn't explain much by itself.
Yes, number 3 and number 4 does not have much big difference, which means that entry and exit does not explain that much of its emission declines. Right. That's so the gap between number 2 and 3, that is the punchline.
So what is the scale effect in like surviving firms, surviving establishments can change in scale, right? So how would you decompose? Yeah, I mean, how would you decompose scale, you know, and surviving?
The total is number 4, not number 1.
I mean, what is the scale effect here?
So the size of the manufacturing sector itself declined.
Sorry, on this one, the drop is immediate for 1997 to 2002.
Drop where?
So the drop of, you know, so you look at the long run, 1997 to 2017, but if you look at this line, right, it goes down in 2002, it's already down where it's at 2017.
Yeah.
So that calls, at least for some explanation, happening before 2001, which is
yes,
drop.
yeah, sure. So here is that's the case. Suppose. So right now I don't have any good answer why before 2001 that has. But a story that is consistent with our finding will be that the import competition from China has been already growing very fast ever since I mean 1980s, and especially in 1990s. Even before China entered the WTO in 2000, the imports from China has been growing fast already. It has become even faster after China entered the WTO, but the growth was already faster, already. So that is one possible explanation. Yeah, but later I will show you that the pre-trend before 2001, there is no pre-trend between high NTR and low NTR groups of industries. So later you will see. So here now the fact 3 is that so this decrease in emission is more pronounced among import-intensive industries. So some industries import more, some industries export more. And then those, so x-axis here is the average import intensity of each industry, and then y-axis is a change in average log emissions in this period. And then here in this graph, the x-axis is average export intensity rather than import. So there's this contrast. For importing, there is this negative relationship, but for exporting, there is no such relationship. And this is a pattern that's kind of indicative already to a pattern that is consistent with pollution offshoring hypothesis. Of course, that's not a definitive evidence, but at least it's indicative. So the empirical strategy we employ is that let's talk about institutional background. So in 1979 already, Deng Xiaoping visited the US and Deng Xiaoping met Jimmy Carter, and then they agreed that China will be subject to no more trade relationship tariff rates. And then so that has significantly lowered the import tariff that the US applies to China. But although the tariff rate has been already low, it has been already NTR tariff rate, but the problem was that there was uncertainty. US Congress had to approve the low anti-tariff rate for China every single year. And then especially there was a lot of uncertainty, especially after Tiananmen Square massacre. And after that happened, US Congress House of Representatives actually passed to revoke the NTR status for China. That did not pass at the Senate, did not pass at the US Senate, but however, it passed. Oh. So there was a great degree of trade policy uncertainty. And then, to measure the magnitude of the shock, we use the entire gap constructed by Pierce and Shaw 2016 AR paper. This is defined as the difference between non-NTR rate and NTR rate. Non-NTR rate is the potential non-NTR rate in each industry that would have been applied if this NTR tariff rate was revoked by US Congress. And NTR, so therefore, NTR gap measures the degree of uncertainty, the degree of trade uncertainty. So let's see. So this using that, we use difference in differences approach. The first difference is the difference between high NTR gap and low NTR gap industries. And second difference is years before and after 2001. And then this is our empirical specification. So left-hand side is log of emissions from establishment P in each industry I in year T. And then right-hand side, our focus is that the interaction between an NTR gap and then the indicator for post-PNTR, which is basically after 2001. And then we have industrial level controls, either time varying or time invariant. And then we include especially establishment fixed effects and counted by year fixed effects. And then this is important because there are environmental regulations that affect each county differently, and that will obviously affect the left-hand side. And then by including county by year fixed effects, we are capturing that. So this is our empirical specification. And
So the slide before, the two slides before this, why are you using not this, the other one, where you have the MFN tariff? Like I was wondering why MFN tariff and not applied effective or any other kind of tariff. Like why are you using the MFN tariff?
Using why? So your question is why we are constructing why you are constructing NTR gap this way?
Exactly.
So this captures the degree of uncertainty, that this industry faces because of the uncertainty that the U.S. Congress might actually revoke the NTR status, NTR tariff rate for China.
So we have the apply effective tariff, we have the MFN tariff from the WTO. So I'm just wondering why you are using the MFN tariff in this case and not any other type of tariff.
So that is actually the NTR rate that is being applied because U.S. Congress actually never, U.S. House actually passed the revoking, but U.S. Senate never did it. So China was subject to NTR tariff rate, actually the NTR tariff rate from 98 to up to now, and then up to even before it entered the WTO.
So meaning China was independent, it doesn't have any relation with them. That's why you are using the MFN.
Yeah, the NTR tariff rate was actually being applied to China, even before China entered the WTO.
Okay.
Yeah. So this is this shock is not coming from changes in actual tariff rate, but it's coming from the removal of trade uncertainty.
Okay.
Yeah. What changed after 2001 is uncertainty. What changed is not actual tariff rate. Where was it? Here? So this is our main result. So what it says is that granting PNTR to China caused a within establishment decrease in pollution emissions. And then we will also conducted to show you dynamic treatment effects. So now the PNTR dummy is now replaced with each year dummy, one by one, right? And then we show that there's no evidence of pre-existing trends here. And precisely after 2001, it appears that there has been a persistent and then negative effect, which accumulates over time. There are a bunch of robustness checks, like control for NAFTA tariff, and then different sub-periods, exclude outliers, and excluding dominant industries which emit the most pollutants, and then various other weighting schemes, and etc.
So Joseph Shapiro has a paper that finds environmental regulations contributed more to the decline in U.S. emission than trade.
Yeah, that paper.
How would you reconcile these two findings?
Yeah, I know that paper. And that paper uses a model that has only exporting part, doesn't have importing part. That paper, and as I showed you, even in the stylized effect part, or I will also show you later in the mechanism part, that it's not the export-intensive industries, or it's import-intensive industries that are responsible for this pattern. And then, so we also show that this decrease in emission is not because of the extensive margin. That is, it's not because manufacturing establishments are shutting down. Even if we narrow down our sample to continuing establishments, we still find actually even stronger effect. And then, and this in our sample, the PNTR did not contribute to more exits of U.S. manufacturing establishments. And then also, we show that this is not because the size of the industry measured by sales is declining. We show that emission intensity, which is defined as the emission divided by sales, also declines. So emission intensity, so even if the dependent variable is emission intensity instead of emission, we still find negative impact. So let's now, I will show you patterns that are consistent with pollution offshoring hypothesis. So now it's triple differences, triple definitive. So the negative impact is stronger for firms that are import intensive, this one, firms that are more import intensive, and then contrast this with this. There's no significant impact for those firms that are export intensive. But for those firms that are import intensive, there is a significant impact. So this contrast is important. So this contrast is reminiscent, again, of the stylized effect that I already showed you. And also, this here non-attainment means those counties which are subject to stricter environmental regulations. And in those counties which are subject to stricter environmental regulations on pollution emissions, the negative impact is stronger. So this is, again, consistent with the idea of a pollution offshoring hypothesis, which says that when trade liberalization happens, the companies in developed economies tend to move their operations to developing economies with laxer environmental regulations. And also this negative impact is stronger for upstream industries. And then we see that oftentimes upstream industries are the industries that offshore their production rather than final goods, because it's the U.S. consumers are the consumers of final goods products. And then also we find that for those firms which have more number of sectors within the firm, among those firms, the negative impact is stronger. So we argue that all of these are consistent with the idea that support the pollution offshoring hypothesis. By the way, we also have, for the sake of space, we didn't include in this slide, but there is also a difference for firm size. So firm size has been already taken into account.
So quick question, sorry, can you observe output or product level composition at the establishment level in the United States?
So there's the sales information.
So you can see the sales associated by, say, HS products for each establishment.
Yeah, it's sales information each establishment.
And is there a way of identifying within industries the products which are more polluting and less polluting?
Which are...
So when you see an establishment continuing, when you first showed the chart on composition, which I was confused by, that change in composition is not an establishment attribute in that first chart. So can you show us the change in composition of output? I think that's a question that Rajesh was also asking at the level of the establishment. And can you show that that change of composition involves dropping products, which on the basis of some other information we can see as more polluting, and so that the surviving establishments are specializing in cleaner products? Is that possible to show?
When it comes to product level, that's basically our, we have a one product, and it's one product level analysis, and that is analysis where we show that for those dirty products, the share of imports from China increases even more because of PNTR. That is one thing. That is one analysis at the product level that we conducted. Other than that, yeah. So yeah, these are the we believe these are patterns that are consistent with pollution offshoring hypothesis, and we'll now try to provide even more direct support for pollution offshoring hypothesis. And then to do so, let's move on. Now, this is our first attempt to do so. We show that PNTR caused the within establishment increase in import activities. And that's not our contribution. This has been already known. PNTR causes an increase in import, of course. But what is new in this paper is that this impact is larger for establishments that initially faced tougher environmental regulations, and also those establishments that engaged in dirty production, which have a high emission intensity. And then also, we show that the PNTR caused an increase in the number of subsidiaries in China, even more so for establishments that initially faced tougher environmental regulations and those who engaged in dirty production. Again, for environmental regulation, we use the non-attainment county level measure. And our third attempt at doing so is the product level analysis that I just mentioned. This is a product HS 10-digit level analysis. And then we measure the share of imports from China, share of US imports from China. So share of imports from China divided by the total imports. And then that share from China increases generically, it increases generically, but it increases even more in industries that are dirtier, in dirtier products. So all of these patterns that I showed you so far, we argue, are consistent with the pollution offshoring hypothesis. Lastly, we investigated another potential mechanism, which is a clean technology adoption. Well, we did not find support for this mechanism. So we really push for a pollution offshoring hypothesis. Oh. So we conclude, so we studied the long-run environmental consequences of trade shock in US manufacturing. And we show that granting PNTR to China had a significant and persistent within establishment declines in pollution emissions. And then we find a strong evidence in support for pollution offshoring hypothesis. Yeah, thank you.
In terms of trying to kind of quantify your size or magnitude of the estimates, if you kind of look at the total, say, PM 2.5 reductions that happen across the US, can you like kind of come up with a back of the envelope calculations as to how much the policy you're looking at makes
if
change?
I can't quantify the number, I remember is I think it was 34%. So if we compare the, if we move industry from bottom percentile of the PNTR to the top percentile of PNTR, then the 34% decline in emission.
No, I meant in terms of there's overall, for a variety of reasons, reductions are happening in the United States, right? One of them is the pollution haven hypothesis, right?
Yeah.
And there are but several other initiatives, like you were saying, you're looking at this, maybe there are several other initiatives which we haven't thought of. I'm saying if you could make a decomposition analysis, let's say this is the total reduction that we observe in the United States between 97 to 2020, how much can your estimates account for the total reduction in some sense, right? That would be an interesting number to know.
Yeah, I agree.
The question is the trade war going to make pollution worse in the United States?
So it's unclear, right? First, it's unclear whether because so we approach this problem through the lens of trade policy uncertainty and as an investment problem. And then when it's an investment problem, what happens is there is a large upfront sunk cost. And then upfront sunk cost has been already paid. The US firms already built subsidiaries in China and already invested in China. It's unclear that whether, so even if there's a trade war going on, I'd say it's quite unclear, but that's also an interesting research agenda as well.
I think it would be interesting to see whether in your county time fixed effect, right, the dynamics over time, you could look at those fixed effects from your estimation. You could try to see whether these are related to the environmental regulations that you mentioned in the US. You have to see whether actually, you know, those also played a role. And going back to the question of how you could quantify the different sources.
Yeah, the regulation played a role, and then regulation played the extent to which regulation played a role depends on the level of PNTR. That's basically what we just showed. So when there is this interaction, it's hard to just say that when there is the interaction between A and B, it's hard to say that this percentage is just A, this percentage is just B. It's hard to say that, but where's the
Yeah, so my question is around the classification of like, have you considered the small and medium businesses? The businesses sort of were probably not like as not under scrutiny as much as large businesses. So in that differentiation, I mean, you spoke briefly about firm size, right? In one of the slides you mentioned because of lack of space, you are not putting that number up there. So I want to understand what's the differentiation between, say, a big business which is under more regulation, more scrutiny compared to someone who's like with pretty small, but on aggregate level, small and medium businesses may also be sort of polluting the environment, right?
Yeah, so we do not find any evidence that large firms respond more sensitively. We do not find any differential. Or firm size. But when it comes to diversification, as I showed you, when for firms that have more number of SIC 4-digit industries, yeah, the negative impact is stronger for those firms.
I noticed that your study focuses on the environmental aspect of ESG, but your implication of work mentioned ESG policies as a whole. New wave of MFN implementing ESG policies. Does your study capture any data related to?
So we don't have ESG data in this paper, but in conclusion, we are just talking about what potential implication our work might have. So it's not what we actually need.
Okay, so thank you very much.
Thank you, Ziho. Thank you to all our speakers for the session. A quick reminder, if you could kindly help us complete the polling for today's session, please scan the QR code on the desk. We will now have a coffee break, and we will reconvene at 4:30 p.m. for the anticipated keynote speech by Amit Khandelwal. Thank you.
Testing 1, 2, 3. Testing.
Last paper by Oscar.
Testing 1, 2.
So thank you very much, everyone, for being here. It's been a great day of presentations, and we look forward to similar enthusiasm and quality tomorrow. So it gives me a great pleasure to introduce our keynote speaker for this conference, Amit Khandelwal, who is the Hahn Professor of Global Affairs and Economics at Yale, where he did his PhD in 2007. So before this, he had been at Columbia University, faculty member there for around 15 years. So I'm very happy to introduce him. I mean, his influential work must be of, we are all must be aware of his influential work in this room. But just to, from his body of good work on many subfields of trade, let me give me one example of the way Amit's work has expanded the research frontier by conducting randomized controlled trials in the trade field, which is not something we see very often. Now, this has expanded our knowledge of how actually firms learn by trading, and also how they adopt technology. So this is just one example among others. One of his recent works has zoomed out from the micro contributions and zoomed out to look at, and this is again joined with Daria, who's also present here, zoomed out to look at cross-country reallocation from the global policy shifts that we have recently seen, which will be, I believe, the topic of today's keynote address. So without any further delay, let me give the floor to Amit. Thank you very much. We are very fortunate to have you here, and looking forward to.
Into a particular area that you want to spend more time on, that's completely fine. But just to give you, we got a bit of a perspective on the U.S.-China trade war from earlier today. But to give a little bit more of concrete numbers behind that. So between the first wave of the tariffs in early 2018 and the kind of final wave towards the end of 2019, the U.S. and China kind of collectively raised tariffs on about $500 billion worth of global trade. And this is large from a historical perspective. So there's many ways one can try to benchmark it with the other large trade war that we're all taught in on the path of becoming economists, which is the Smoot-Hawley tariffs during the Great Depression. But if you think about just the share of GDP that was affected by a tariff increase, the U.S. raised rates on about 20% of U.S. imports, roughly 2.5% of GDP. China targeted about 11% of its imports, roughly 3.6% of GDP. And to put that in perspective, the Smoot-Hawley tariffs were targeted on about 1.4% of GDP, according to work from Doug Irwin. Now, this is not to say that just from that alone, you should conclude that the trade war was more important than the Smoot-Hawley tariffs. The level of tariffs at that time were much higher. There were specific tariffs that were occurring during a time of disinflation. So the setting is quite different, but that gives you a sense of the scale that's involved in the current trade war. Now, despite the 2020 agreement that occurred in January 2020, the tariff levels still remain elevated, and if anything, we seem to be increasing the level of trade tensions, now moving away from tariffs into investments and investment bans and export controls. So the Biden administration has not reversed its policies on China relative to the Trump administration. If anything, we're now seeing more increased export controls on national security products. I saw a report in the newspaper today that it seems that the Biden administration may be coming out with an investment ban, so an outright ban on U.S. investors holding particular sectors in China. And in general, this is compounded by a deterioration of the political relationship. So what I'm going to do today is just talk through a couple of research projects in which we've tried to analyze the economic impacts of the U.S.-China trade war. So what we'll do is I'll spend a little bit of time thinking about and talking about how we've traced the impacts on the U.S. and the Chinese economies, and then perhaps of greater interest to the audience here, which is what is the potential impacts on what I'll call bystander countries. All right, so this is basically just going to be an overview of three papers. One is a paper looking at the impacts of the trade war on the U.S. economy. With my co-author Pablo Fagoban, we wrote a review article summarizing all of the work that had been worked on the U.S.-China trade war up to that moment in time, and then this work with Daria as well as on looking at it's more current looking at the impacts on bystander countries. Okay, so just to give you a sense of the timeline involved, this is a graph that we saw a version of this graph earlier today, but this is a graph produced by Chad Bowen, who's done some incredible work on the U.S.-China trade war throughout this episode. This is just showing the average tariff rates here of the U.S. On imposing tariffs on all other countries except for China. And at the very outset of the trade war, we actually did see the U.S. increasing tariff rates on specific products, washing machines, solar panels, steel and aluminum, and they kind of slowly ratcheted up tariffs on other non-U.S. non-China trade partners. All right, so that's the jump up here. Now, during that period, the U.S. then subsequently in the summer of 2018 ratcheted up tariffs in the first of 5 waves on imports from China, and the Chinese responded essentially one for one with retaliatory tariffs, and you can see that in this picture here, which is over a series of several waves. We see a big ratcheting up of tariffs where the U.S. tariffs on China were pretty low, roughly 3% on average. They're now at roughly 20%. China had relatively higher tariffs on U.S. goods, about 7%, but that's been also ratcheted up to 20%. Okay, so that's point number 2. Now, the third thing that is often underappreciated during this period was that while China was raising tariffs on the U.S. In response to the U.S.'s actions, it was simultaneously lowering its MFN tariffs on the rest of the world. So there we go. All right, so here's the Chinese tariffs on imports from the rest of the world, and you can see that there's a general decline in the tariffs here. And it remains to be, we can discuss whether this should be considered part of the trade war, but at least my reading of the work that Chad Bowen has done on this is that these were China, while they were simultaneously raising rates on the U.S., they were simultaneously also then trying to reduce its MFN rates in order to exacerbate the preferences between them. Okay, now this thing, you'll see that up until now, I've just stopped the slides up until January 2020, when the Phase 1 agreement was signed. And the only point I want to make here is that the Phase 1 agreement continues, it lowered tariffs slightly, but it did not reduce them. Right? And so we are still in a regime of quite high elevated tariffs, certainly high in historical perspectives. And so the discussion that we can have today is very much one of an important policy discussion that is currently ongoing. Okay, so one thing that you might be interested in looking at is like, what are just the direct effects of the tariffs? All right, so how can we visualize the impacts? And a lot of what we saw today in a series of papers was kind of filtering the impacts of trade through some quantitative model that would give you some aggregate impacts. But it's sometimes useful just to look at the microdata and just look at what were the trade responses, and then you can think about how you might feed those responses into a model to turn kind of difference in difference outcomes into some aggregate number. Okay, so that's what I'll do here, which is just to take the publicly available US import and export data, where in the US you can download the data by month. You'll get origins from imports from HS10 level products from all countries in the world, and we can match the tariff rate changes on those product codes, and we can think about what is going to be the impact of particular varieties, the value of a variety, or the quantity of a variety, or the unit value, the value over the quantity of a variety, where I'm referring to a variety as an origin product pair. Okay, so we can do this through an event study. I won't go through all the details of the event study, but just think about a process in which I'm going to follow a particular variety over time. And the way I'm going to do that is I'm going to think about the change in a variety's say value from a given country in a product code G at a moment in time. And I'm going to have this variety fixed effect. So I'm just going to be looking at the time series of a given variety. And then I'm going to knock out some trends of that particular product code. So within a product code, there are going to be many varieties. And then I'm going to knock out some trends from the origin country, such as China. So that's a GT effect. And then I'm just going to define the event as the period in which the first variety in a product is hit with the tariff. And then I'm going to look at what are the impacts of a given variety that's targeted with the tariffs relative to the untargeted. Okay, so it's a relatively simple event study, just to look at the effects. And what are we interested in? We're interested in thinking about what is the impact on trade. What is the impact on import values? What is the impact on quantities? And then the impacts on unit values. And I'll come back to why looking at unit values is so crucial. All right, so here's just a direct effect. This is like a quasi first stage of just looking at what are the effects of the tariffs on average. And so in some sense, this is by construction, because I'm defining year or month 0, the event date as 0, as being the moment of when the tariffs come. Okay, so this is just showing you that essentially that the code is correct. But on average, we get about a 15% jump, and this is pulling across the different waves of tariffs over time. And you also see here that China is also retaliating with roughly equivalent size increases on the U.S. goods. Okay, so now let me give you some outcomes as to what happened to the U.S. trade. This is a picture here showing the impact on the value of trade, and you can see that when the tariffs come into effect, you get a kind of an immediate 20% drop in trade, and then it kind of continues to decline. There is this jump up here, which your eyes are probably looking at, and what is that effect? That turns out to be driven by one event in which the Trump administration said that it was going to ratchet up the tariffs on a set of goods that it had already targeted in a few months, in which they didn't subsequently actually impose that, but you saw a lot of reporters kind of front-running a potential increase in tariff. And so that's kind of just an anticipatory effect of a potential second wave of a tariff effect that was going to hit a group of goods. Yeah. Yeah, it's a good question. So in the beginning, it was on particular sectors. It was washing machines, solar panels, aluminum, and steel. But then once the trade war shifted away from these particular products to basically affecting China's trade, it was more or less blanketed across China's goods, more or less. Yeah.
Just one other question, Amit, in terms of either your work or others, which helps us to understand, were these products designed to cause maximum pain to the US, or were they also designed to minimize the political pain domestically? Is there work on that, or do we understand the selection of products?
Yeah, so there isn't great evidence as to why. I mean, in some sense, you're saying, why is the trade war coming in at this moment in time? You know, in trade, we think about the decision of a country to impose tariffs as kind of three potential stories going on. One is there's a terms of trade externality that you're going to try to force on your partner. Okay, so you impose the tariff, and then you're going to essentially get your trade partner to eat some of that tariff by forcing their before tariff prices down. And I'm going to come back to that point. So the basic message here is that that does not seem to have happened in the case. So that's one story which can't explain what was going on. The second story that people often refer to is kind of Grossman-Heltman argument of protection for sale. And if you look at the reports coming around at that time, you can't really find evidence that there are firms lobbying for this trade war at that moment in time. Okay, so and one way to see this is it comes back to the point later earlier is that when the tariffs came into effect, they kind of just went into all industries. A protection of sale, for argument, would protect some industries relative to others, and we didn't see evidence of that. So we don't think that there's a protection for sale argument driving why the trade war unfolded in the U.S. Now, the third story people often talk about is kind of a median voter story, which is you can use a particular policy instrument to tilt voters on your behalf. And I do think, and in the paper, in this first paper we showed, we do seem to find some evidence of that. And if you give me a few slides, I'll come back to that point on that. So between these three stories, it seems to be one in which the Trump administration was potentially using the tariffs to swing particular groups of voters, and you'll see a map as to who those voters might have been. Okay, good. So here's the impact on values. Here's the impacts on quantities. Okay, and so now these kind of look similar on both ways. And the big question that people, if you had asked trade economists when the tariffs were unfolding, what was going to be the incidence of the tariff on the U.S. economy, I think most economists would have said, and at least we thought when we were doing the analysis, was that the incidence would be kind of half borne by the Chinese side and half borne by the U.S. side, and that kind of tariff incidence is something that is out there in the literature when we look at the pass-through results from previous episodes. And certainly when you look at the exchange rate literature, which is that when the exchange rate changes, you typically get a sharing of that change movement in the exchange rate between both parties of roughly a half. And so a really big important question in this in thinking about the impact on the U.S. economy comes down to what is the pass-through of this tariff, and how do we measure the pass-through? Well, one way to look at the pass-through is to just look at the before tariff price. So if the before tariff price does not change, that means that the after tariff price is going to change one for one with the tariff. And in that case, there's complete pass-through of the tariff to the U.S. consumers. Now, the other extreme setting is that if the before tariff price falls by the amount of the tariff, then you effectively have pushed the incidence of the tariffs on the exporting side. You have made the exporters eat the tariff, and that's the terms of trade externality gain that the U.S. could have achieved. And so the next picture that I'll flip up is kind of the main picture and the main result that people have kind of anchored around in thinking about the trade war. And so this shows the before tariff price, which is the tariffs come into effect on to time 0. What happens to values over quantities? And there's essentially no change. And if anything, there's kind of a very slight increase. This is the price paid by the U.S. importer before the taxes. Exactly. And you can see here that there's no change. There's no change, which means that now they'll flip up the unit values which are inclusive of the duties, and those essentially move one for one with the tariffs. Okay, so the reason that visualizing these effects is quite useful is it immediately started for us to realize what the impacts of the trade war is, and you can see that when the tariffs of 20% are coming in, and you get this complete pass-through result, it means that the U.S. consumers were taking it on the chin and paying effectively 20% higher border prices. Yeah, so it's a very good point. So in this paper, I'm using data at the border So once it comes inside the US economy, we don't know how it gets distributed within the supply chain. And that's kind of a very interesting next step that I think would be.
And this isn't just a short-term phenomenon. And what might be the reason? Why did this happen?
Great questions. Okay, so on the short term, I'm not sure this is a short-term phenomenon. So here's a picture that comes from Steve Redding, Mary Amidi, and David Weinstein, which looked, this was now 12 months after the trade war. And if you just look at the top picture, this one, just think about one being the 100% pass-through. Okay, so if it's 1, it's full pass-through. If it's half, 0.5, it's half pass-through. And across all goods, they go in a longer run follow-up, they go 12 months past, and you still see it elevated rates. And effectively, you see that in all sectors, with the exception of steel, where it jumped up and kind of went down, and you got incomplete pass. And so that's kind of one piece of evidence that this is not just a temporary phenomenon, which many of us thought. And in the earlier paper that we wrote, we were looking at that time at a relatively short time horizon as the trade war was unfolding, but it seems like it's something that's remained higher. Here's another paper showing. Okay, so we use publicly available data. There's another paper that was published around the same time that built up the import price indexes from the micro data that the BLS uses to form import price indexes, finding the exact same result, showing essentially a full pass-through of the tariffs into border prices. And then there's some work done. This is a little bit harder to read in this graph, but there's some work done looking at what was happening in the washing machine sector in particular. There they do have retail prices, and there they show 1-for-1 increase. So I think through a variety, there were maybe 4 or 5 papers kind of all published around the same time, kind of documenting that there was this pass-through. It was not a very short-run phenomenon if there seems to be a medium. Now, why there is complete pass-through, I think, is a much harder answer to give. And in the survey chapter that Pablo and I wrote, we kind of walked through 8 potential stories for why there may be pass-through. In the language of the paper that we wrote, this is effectively a horizontal supply curve. And why is it horizontal? That you would think that the U.S. economy wouldn't be facing a horizontal supply curve. And so I think we pegged this as a pretty open question still as to why we observe complete pass-through in this period, whereas in previous episodes you didn't always find that. Okay. Now this is what's happening on the U.S. export side. So now the U.S. exports are also being hit by retaliatory tariffs, and you can see a similar finding here. It's a little bit noisier, and that's because of some data issues that I'm happy to talk about. But you effectively see a decline in U.S. exports, and you actually see complete pass-through to the Chinese side as well. Okay. All right. So one part of this paper was just kind of documenting this, and then we wanted to put it into a quantitative framework to kind of think about how do you pull all these numbers together into some summary statistic as to the impact of the war. And if you think about what that exercise does, that exercise is going to have to keep track of 3 different constituents in an economy. We have U.S. consumers, we have U.S. producers, and then we've got U.S. government. And so we want to think about how is the tariff going to propagate through that economy. And we actually saw versions of this model already today. So we think that the consumers are going to be worse off. How much worse off is going to depend on the extent of the tariff pass-through. In this episode, it turns out that when a tariff of 20% comes into effect, it gets fully passed on. And so that ended up being a relatively simple part of the analysis to figure out, which is that the U.S. consumers are facing after tariff prices that go up by the amount.
So the pass-through price that you're showing us is the price of Chinese products, or the price of Chinese and similar products is higher?
Yeah. So what I was showing you was the price of the targeted stuff. Now there's 3. So I'm not going to go through this in a lot of detail today, but there's different margins of substitution we can be thinking about. So we take a particular good, say electronic devices. They come from China. They get hit by a tariff of 20%. There's going to be a substitution to non-Chinese varieties within here. And then there's going to be a substitution potentially between this mouse and then another kind of product that may be hit with a lower tariff or not hit at all. And then that's within imported goods. And then you can think about the substitution between imported and domestic. And in the paper, what we use is we build a tariff instrument over those three levels to pin down the elasticity of the substitution at each of those stages.
And what does it tell us about the demand curve in the United? You said this is consistent with a supply, horizontal supply in China, but the US has domestic production, which is huge, even and other imports. So why is it that you don't get
immediate substitution?
Yeah.
Yeah. So empirically, what we end up looking at, so that becomes crucial, because if the domestic sector can immediately substitute, then the impacts are quite minimal. And so just think about a time path of the changes in imports when the tariffs get hit, and then the changes in domestic production in the US in a particular sector. And you can look at that time path, and it turns out that the elasticity of substitution is not huge. It's about 1.5. And so that time path gives us a sense in which the substitution was not. That's how we do it in the paper. Okay, so there's this impact on U.S. consumers, and then as Aditya was alluding to, how much U.S. producers are better off depends on that substitution, which we can look at the relative differences in imports relative to domestic production within that sector, or if we had better data within the exact same product, but we don't have better data than that. But then there's two other components, all of which have been important themes of in conference today. Of course, how much you are better off depends on what how substitutable your goods are with imports. But if you're using imported inputs that are also getting tariffed, that's gonna dampen the effect on U.S. producers. Okay, so the cost bundle is going to go up. That's the value chain story that we've been discussing today. And then there's this third component, which is the trade war was not just U.S. imposing tariffs on China, it was also China imposing tariffs on the U.S. And that's going to dampen global demand, which will be an offsetting effect. Okay, so through the lens of a model, you have to take into account both the substitution, the retaliations, and the increase in costs. Okay? And so the net effect is something that would just depend on the relative magnitudes. And then there's some government revenue that the country. Okay, so I'm not going to go through that model in a lot of detail, but I'm going to flip up a couple of kind of back of the envelope calculations which are useful to benchmark it. So there's an old idea in trade in which you can look at the effects of the welfare effects of changes in border prices by thinking about the impact on import prices, which is, you can think about this as a consumer term, the impact on export prices, which is kind of a think about that on a producer side, and then the government revenue. So this is effectively the terms of trade, right? Now, if you're in an economy with complete pass-through, then a first-order impact of the trade war is simply the magnitude of the price changes. Okay? It's simply the magnitude of the price changes. That's not fully, this is leaving aside the two other components that I talked about just a moment ago, which is the input-output structure and the retaliation. So I'll come back to that. But if you just think about a small open economy with complete pass-through, what is the first-order impact of the tariff? It's just by how much do import. And so we can use some benchmarks. So imports to GDP, it's roughly in the US is 15%. Fraction of trade targeted, it's about 15% or a little bit more. And then how much did the tariffs go up, or how much did prices go up? In a complete pass-through world, they go up by the amount of the tariffs, it's about 15% on average. And so the impact, or the first order welfare effect will just be 0.15 to the third. So that's about a 0.3% of GDP. Okay, so that's a first order effect. You can do a second order calculation where the second order is now going to take into account the change in demand. Okay, so the first order effect holds demand fixed. Second order effect will say you're going to change quantities as well. We can estimate that elasticity of substitution as we do in the paper. Then that puts the second order effect at about 0.06%. Okay, but still not the world that we're in. The world that we're in has a full input-output structure. It has retaliations. And then in the model, we build in a potential terms of trade effect, terms of trade benefit for the US through a fixed factor at the sectoral level. So once you bring in those three components and you use the demand and supply elasticities from the tariff changes, and actually one thing that I would love to have more time, we can talk about it at dinner, is that it turns out that you can use the tariff changes to simultaneously estimate the supply curve and the demand curve. It's a beautiful magic trick actually. And so you can simultaneously recover both the supply curve and the demand curve with the tariff change, which is counter the normal arguments that we normally make, where you need one instrument for the supply curve and an instrument for the demand. So I'm happy to chat more about that after the talk. Okay, but you can use those estimated elasticities and kind of feed them into the model. And what do you get? You get the following picture, which is the aggregate impacts on the US economy, which is broken down into those three terms. This is the consumer term, this is the producer term, this is government revenue, and this is the total effect. And what we get over the waves through September of 2019 is about a 0.13% decline in US GDP. But there's really there's a large redistribution within the economy. So this is a case where I think focusing on the aggregates is often not that useful if there's very large distributional consequences. And at least according to this framework, and again, it's really coming out of the responses of the prices, you get a pretty big effect on US consumers or the importers, which is a decline in GDP of about 0.61%. And that gets transferred some to the producers and some in terms of government revenue. Yeah.
What's the assumption about where government revenues goes here?
Yeah. So in this paper, we use I guess the standard thing, which is we just lump sum rebate them back to all the consumers.
Because in US case, we saw it was basically targeted toward export sectors, right?
Yeah. So there's part of this, which is this point was that a subsector, a certain region of the US was hit harder by the trade war than others, which is the agricultural producing regions. And the US did start cutting checks to those government producers. I remember when I was asked by, when I was in New York, I was asked by an investment company to come and give a talk on an overview of the trade war. And their presuming assumption was that the government revenue is just burnt. Okay, so you can have different assumptions on what you think the US government can do, but here we just rebate them back. No, that's all in here. That's all in. This is the full model, but I'm not going to give you the details of that model. The one thing I can show you is that you can run this scenario by shutting down the retaliations. You can ask yourself, what would have been the impact on the US economy if there was no retaliations? And that's this number here. All the numbers are the same, with the exception of this producer term, which is that the US producers would have been much better off. And so all the retaliation they're doing is just dampening demand for US goods. And in fact, yeah, there would have been a smaller effect on the US. Okay, so this kind of benchmarks the aggregate impacts of the trade war on the US economy. It turns out that there was a research team based in Singapore which did this exact same analysis using the exact same data from the Chinese side. So we can actually have an apples to apples comparison on the impact of the Chinese economy, and they get something much bigger. So something like 0.3% of Chinese GDP, which of course makes sense given the importance of export and trade relative to GDP and China relative to the US. Okay. Now coming back to this point that Aditya was alluding to earlier, I also then, again, I mentioned this, I think focusing on the aggregate misses some important distributional consequences. What this picture shows is you take the production structure of the US economy and you map the production structure to the changes in the tariffs, and you're going to find that there's a differential impact of a differential increase in the tariff rates across geographies in the US. And in particular, you get the Rust Belt and heavy manufacturing areas in North Carolina and in and around Ohio really facing a high increase in import tariffs relative to other parts of the country. And going back to Ditya, one of the things that we did in that first paper is we correlated the increases in tariff rates, which is just data, at this zip code or county level with vote shares. And you actually get, it's quite interesting. I'm not sure I fully believe it, but that's what comes out in doing that analysis, is you will get, okay, so put tariff on the y-axis, so import tariff of the county on the y-axis, and the vote share for Trump on the x-axis, and you get a perfect inverted view. You get a perfect inverted view. So the really heavily Republican counties and the really heavily Democratic counties don't experience an increase in tariffs, but right in the quote-unquote swing areas, you see relatively higher. Now, whether that was by design or by luck, I don't know. Okay, but all this is to say is that I think, kind of focusing on the spatial impacts is one dimension that's of interest, and that this is the increase in U.S. Imports, and then looking at the increase in the retaliations, you can see that the retaliations were heavily targeted towards the agricultural sector, which is disproportionately in the. Okay, so this is sort of one kind of analysis that looks at the effects on the U.S. economy, and then a similar one was done on the Chinese economy. A big thing that seems to have emerged that I think across many research teams using different kinds of data over different time horizons seems to be that this pass-through result seems there. But I don't think we have a great understanding as to why that pass-through, why we see complete pass-through in this episode.
Sorry to interrupt. So I think during this period, both countries were introducing new policies to help the firms and consumers who are hit by tariffs from the other side.
Yeah.
So in your estimation, would you consider these other policies that might be a component?
Yeah. So, well, okay. So there's the one main policy that the U.S. Didn't use that much under the Trump administration, but the Biden administration has expanded it. Is the use of tariff exemptions. So a firm can apply to the government to be exempt from the tariff. And I'm still waiting to see a paper. I mean, it's a very obvious paper to write, which is who got the exemptions and why, right? So I'm still waiting to see that paper. But that I think is the big kind of policy that we would have seen that's kind of undermined the impact of the trade war. But that was happening more in the Biden administration. Now there's other impacts like export bans and export controls, which we don't consider in this analysis. Cheng Tai-Sheh and Michael Song have a paper where they're looking at the non-trade barriers that arose from the China trade war, and they argue that they're pretty sizable.
Amit, before you proceed, so if I were to summarize the headline finding the way I understood it, and please correct me if I'm wrong, is that in the US, consumers lost or are losing, but producers are actually benefiting.
Yeah.
If that's the case, the political economy is quite interesting because producers are much better organized. So that means these guys will put pressure, and gals will put pressure on the administration for these restrictions to remain in place.
Yeah.
Do you buy that hypothesis?
The initial. Okay, so from the lens of the model, it's kind of, there's this benefit to U.S. producers because of the substitution.
Right.
But then there's this worsening of, that's dampened by higher increase in costs from the input-output channel, and then the dampening of demand. And it's true that in our model, they kind of come out on top, or they come out as a gain. I don't think that U.S. firms are lobbying for further increases in the tariffs, but I also don't see a lot of evidence that U.S. producers are claiming that we should remove the tariffs.
Right.
What,
So what I'm saying is,
I would have thought.
yeah. So what I'm saying is, because of your findings, U.S. producers would not be incentivized
Yes.
to say, let's remove the tariff. In
Correct.
fact, they would be
lobbying for even more. So
Right.
I think I'm more to be honest, I'm a little bit more distrustful of that part of the model because it's less disciplined by the data.
Okay.
In the sense that we see some, that's more of a production structure that we impose and we run things through.
Got it.
There's some work that was mentioned earlier by Kyle Hanley, which has been looking at kind of using monthly level data or quarterly level employment data and showing that there are negative employment effects, particularly through the because of the retaliations on U.S. firms. And so I think the U.S. business community is not clamoring for higher tariffs because I think there's also a sense in which these are static models that don't take into account dynamic investment decisions, which may be quite important. And I generally think that the business community in the U.S. is generally viewing the trade war as not being particularly beneficial. But then there's also,
And second quick question, do you have a similar map for China, where you show the spatial impacts?
Yeah, I don't have that map, but I think it's possible that the other paper that I alluded to has done this. Okay, how long do I go? I'm running close on time. Okay. Okay. All right, great. So let me now shift to a newer paper that we've been working on. This is joint work with Daria as well, which is looking at the impacts on what we'll call bystander countries. And this is also, I think, a relatively straightforward paper. I think one of the things that were kind of interested in using, or kind of interested in exploring in this paper, was that once these tariffs come into effect, we, even in this conference, have talked a lot about various driving forces of global trade. So there's supply chains, there's specialization, there's the patterns of substitutability and complementarity of goods, there's potential economies of scale. And once the tariffs go into place, you can see global trade reallocate, and it potentially gives us a window into these different forces that may be driving global trade. So what we do in this paper is we just look at it's a relatively straightforward paper. We take the top 50 exporters in the world, we take product level exports, and we match those product level exports to the tariff changes. So think about Malaysia being indirectly affected by the tariff changes, India being indirectly affected by the tariff changes, Cambodia, and so forth. And then we just look at the relative impacts of exports in the taxed products relative to the untaxed. And then we have a series of findings. So the kind of first finding that we thought was kind of interesting was that when the trade war comes into effect, you do see the result that you would expect, which is that there is a substitution of U.S. consumers out of Chinese goods into bystander goods. Okay, so they increase their exports to the U.S. So that kind of makes sense. We don't see much of a change in exports to China. So that's something we could talk a little bit more about. But then in a standard world, in this kind of standard world where firms are operating, or industries are operating on upward sloping supply curves, if you start exporting more to the US, that capacity has to come from somewhere. And so you should be pulling back from your exports to the rest of the world. And we don't find this on average for bystander countries. So we find that they increase their exports to the US, they don't really change their exports to China, but that their exports to the rest of the world increase. They increase. And so this result seems to suggest that the trade war, if anything, kind of created some net opportunities for the typical bystander country. But there is very large heterogeneity across countries in their growth of goods that were tariffed during the trade war relative to the untariffed goods. So there's very large heterogeneity, and I'll show you a picture documenting that heterogeneity. Now, the next natural question to ask would be, well, why is it the case that some countries like Vietnam are going to respond more to the tariffs relative to other countries like India? And it could be for various reasons related to pre-existing specialization. It could be that it happened to be the case that Vietnam exports a certain sector that's tariffed more relative to other sectors. It may be that in some sectors just have a higher response, like the electronic sector relative to the apparel sector. But what we find is that there's kind of a country component, so something kind of specific about Vietnam that's driving this this increase in heterogeneity, this large heterogeneity across countries. Seems to be a country component as opposed to something that may be sector or a size component. That's something that again I can come back to. And then finally, something that I won't spend much time talking about. Well, yeah, given the time, I may not spend too much time talking about it, which is, you know, you can use these patterns of responses to kind of unpack parameter spaces where we think that different countries are operating in. Okay, so just go back to this example where I see a country like Mexico or Taiwan increasing their exports to the US when the tariffs come into effect. I then also see Mexico and Taiwan increasing their exports to the rest of the world. And so if I see them increasing their exports to the US and to the rest of the world, that's going to tell me that Mexico and Taiwan exports products that are substituted for China. When China became more costly in the US, Mexico and Taiwan grew in the US market. But then if I also
sorry to interrupt, I have quick questions. Yep. So like when you mentioned the bystanders increase export to the United States, I'm wondering like what is China's export to those bystanders? So is it possible that some of the bystanders that actually export, China is using them as export platforms?
Yes,
So,
that's
yeah.
certainly possible. Yes. And so if you just had a simple rerouting of trade, you would get China exporting to Vietnam and then Vietnam forwarding those products to the US. And I think that would certainly be reconciled in our model. But I think the interesting finding was that once you saw the reallocation from China, say, into Vietnam, Vietnam is increasing not just to the US, but also to the rest of the world, also to India and Colombia and so forth. And so it's that kind of expansion in exports to the rest of the world, which we think was kind of interesting. So going back to this example, if you have Mexico and Taiwan increasing their exports to the US, that tells us that they are likely producing substitutes for Chinese goods. But then if they're also increasing those goods to the rest of the world, we're going to use that kind of moment in the data to tell us something about whether the supply curve of Vietnamese or the Taiwanese or Mexican goods is upward sloping or downward sloping. Because if the supply curve was upward sloping, as they increase their goods to the US, it should be declining from China. It should be declining to the rest of the world. But if it's on a downward slope supply curve, potentially driven by, for example, scale effects, then you can get an increase in both.
So,
okay, so
I mean, just one quick point. I was saying that, and we are seeing this phenomenon when China itself will be exporting more to the rest of the world. So, you know, because it can't. And so I think the assumption of what the original equilibrium was and why it's, you know, it took this, you know, shock to China for these countries to become more competitive. And China had a revealed advantage relative to these countries in most markets, and was now also going to switch its exports to these other markets. So understanding what that initial equilibrium was in a more micro sense, to which one shock led these countries to actually.
Yeah, there's a good point. So, you know, if I can interpret your question in another way, is you're asking, had China not already in a counterfactual world where China had not experienced a large increase in wages, for instance, and we saw the trade war, would we have gotten this result? Yeah, that's an interesting question. So in our model, like we're pretty flexible in how we think about the production structure, in the sense that we just want to think about a potential curve that's upward sloping or downward sloping, but we don't build into the model, for instance, fixed costs of production, where there may be a moment in time when a marginal change in the tariff can trigger the entry of a new plant, for instance, of FDI from coming. We don't have that detail embedded into the structure, and it's largely because we're not working in this project with micro level data to be able to discipline whether we're in that model or not. So I think it's a good question. Good question to add.
Sorry, is it possible that the main mechanism is demand? Just think about China and United States are both severely weakened by the trade war, and other countries, look at Malaysia, and it's developing so well. And this increase in demand and income from the rest of the world is driving this increase in trade flow to the rest of the world, even with higher marginal cost of production.
So that story, I'm not quite sure. So these are certainly demand shocks that Vietnam is facing. So when China is taxed in the U.S. economy, it's a demand shock for Vietnamese goods.
Yeah,
and I guess what we're saying is that demand shock can trace out whether exports are increasing from Vietnam to the rest of the world or going up or down.
My point was Vietnam became richer because of trade war, and they have higher income to spend.
Oh,
that
I see.
creates a demand shock for
Yeah.
other countries.
Yeah, so I'm not going to present the model here, but we're not going to so this is not going to be a quantitative model that's going to account for that potential demand shock story that could be a feedback. So we're going to try to neutralize that story through a set of fixed effects, essentially. But it's certainly possible that collectively in the rest of the world, there could have been some GE effect that's also driving things, but we don't kind of focus on that.
Just a counter. As someone who was working in the export trade around the time that you've been looking at this data, China by 2016 was already, they knew this was coming. They were already investing, not outsourcing, not using these countries as platforms. They were investing in these countries, and they knew which industries to put the money into. So my theory, therefore, would be that you're looking at an increase in supply capacity in a lot of these countries, like say Vietnam and Mexico, funded primarily by China, knowing exactly what they were doing. And therefore, it's not demand driven, but it would actually be that you were just seeing supply moving. And it made for great.
Yeah, so I think that trend is going on. I don't know if I'll have time to show it to you all, but the way the analysis work is always to compare products that are taxed relative to untaxed. And so in your story, it has to be a story in which the trend in investment had to be correlated with the future tariff changes.
Which
could have been.
I say, as someone on the ground, I did see happening.
Yeah. So let me give me a couple seconds. We can look at the pre-trend graph to see whether that was in fact what was going on. Yeah. Okay. So I think what I'll do is let me just show you the raw data patterns. I'm not going to have time to do this, to go through the full paper, of course. Let me just show you a couple of raw data patterns. Hopefully that continues this discussion, and then then I'll just kind of end it from there, rather than going into the full framework. Okay, so just empirically, what am I going to do? I'm going to take the top 50 exporters, take product level exports at the HS6 level. Look at a 2-year growth window. So their growth in trade from January of 2018 to December of 2019. And then I'm going to think about 4 sets of tariffs. There's the US tariff on China, China's tariff on the US, and then at the beginning of the talk, I mentioned that the US did also, and China also did change tariffs directly on bystander countries. And so we're just going to be thinking about matching the basic idea in this paper is for each country, compare the export growth in taxed relative to untaxed goods. Okay, and then I won't go through this in more detail, but we have a model then that kind of guides how to interpret the responses that we see. Okay, so I'm going to skip that part of the model, and we can just look at these pictures. Okay, so this is just showing, and I'm also now going to extract away from the heterogeneity and just look at the average response. So pool all bystander countries together, and then I'm going to show you. In the last figure that I'll end on is I'll show the heterogeneity across countries. Okay, so this is going to be the pre-war period, and then this will be the post-war. This will be the war period, and then this will be the pre-war period. And I'm going to look at the changes in exports against the US tariff on China of bystander countries. This is a very simple univariate regression, okay? The paper does subsequently more complicated things, and it's just a bin scatter. So it's just a bin scatter. Okay, so here you see that when the tariff comes, that higher tariff rates seems to translate to an increase in exports to the US on the bystander countries. Okay. Now we can look at what happens to their exports to China. And this is now when China imposes a tariff on the US, what happens to Vietnam's exports to China? Okay, and it's basically flat. It's basically flat. I have some stories as to why I think that's in fact the case, and Daria and I we've discussed this quite a bit, but we can talk about it. But empirically, it's flat. Okay, now what about exports to the rest of the world? So now let's look at the same tariff that the U.S. imposes on China, and now look at exports to non-U.S. and China. And this is, yeah, here's the post-period. Here's the post-period elasticity, and so you can see it's upward sloping here against the U.S. tariff, and it's upward sloping against the Chinese tariff as well. Yeah. Here is a bin scatter. This is a bin scatter. So the data are country by product. So there's what, 5,000 products by 50 countries, and then bin scattered into 20 points. That just means that there's a trend in the average exports during this period across all countries. Okay. So the paper then does more sophisticated stuff, I would say, empirically with the regression. But this is basically the surprising finding that we kind of anchored around, which is exports to the US are increasing, exports to the rest of the world also increasing. And then the model provides a way to interpret that. And so the last picture that I'll show you is just, I'm going to take this simple regression, make it a little bit more complicated by thinking about all 4 tariffs at once, and then run it separately for each country. So I'm going to look at Vietnam's exports to each to these destinations separately from Cambodia's exports. And so I'm going to get a differential, I'm going to get heterogeneous tariff responses by country. And then I'll aggregate them up using each variety's pre-war weight in the country's export bundle. And then I'll leave you with this graph that we can use as a basis for further discussion, which is in some sense a way of summarizing the relative exports to the world across different countries. And so we've just ordered them here. So you take a country like Vietnam, and these are kind of bootstrapped standard error bars around these estimates. But you get a country like Vietnam, we find, according to our data, as a relative quote winner. Their growth relative in tax relative to untaxed products is relatively higher compared to other countries in example. This is including the United States and China as well. So this is exports to the entire globe. Exactly, yes. And in the paper, we break it out by those three destinations, but this is to the world. And so this accords with, I would say, like a lot of the newspaper articles that were coming around at the time was showing the reload going on. That's different from, say, the Ukraine, Egypt, Israel, Colombia. And then I guess for this talk, I was going to highlight Malaysia. So Malaysia sits right here as a relative winner. It's a little bit noisy at the result. And so you get kind of this large differences in the responses, which is, in the paper we try to understand this a little bit more deeply, and it's really, you can come up with the story where Vietnam specializes in electronics, and electronics are highly responsive to the tariffs compared to apparel, and that's what's driving the response. But that doesn't seem to be what's going on. It doesn't seem to be what's going on. It seems to be that there's something kind of a country component to the response that's kind of driving Vietnam to be up here relative to another country over here. And the paper does not go one step farther to try to really understand why those country factors are generating the heterogeneous elasticities. But I think it's kind of an area for okay, so what I'll do is I'll just end with this slide. So I'll make one point. So we're certainly in this new era of globalization where we've seen tariffs. We're now moving to a world of export bans, investment bans, and kind of more systematic decoupling. Global trade is reallocating, but really where I think we need a lot more work is, a lot of what we did in these series of papers was working with product level data, and product level data are still pretty aggregated. So all medical devices in this world kind of will fit into one HS6 code. So it's like it's pretty crude, and it doesn't really give us a sense as to how this reallocation is going. So the discussion that you mentioned earlier, which is this is all coming on the backs of FDI and for platforms, I think our data can't speak to that, but we know that's going on, and we would like to get a sense of this. And where I think one can make the most progress is something that I end all my talks on now, which is that we need kind of more sector-specific analyses. And in particular, if we're trying to think about the value chain relocations, I think input-output matrices are quite crude. And if we just honed in on one sector, for instance, we'd really be able to understand what's happening in that sector. And then how do you build external validity? Is you just do 100 of those across different sectors. I think we'll have a much richer picture as to what's going on if we can dig into those specifics. Okay, so I'm sorry for rushing towards that. Hopefully that sense of the
First of all, I think we ought to give you a round of applause for concluding your keynote despite all the interruptions we kept throwing your way.
No, the interruptions are great.
So two things, and I'm sort of completely shooting in the dark here. So I understand your point on country factors driving reallocations.
Yeah.
What about regional factors? So, for example, regional trade agreements, and different countries have different depth and intensity, or whatever metric you want to use of regional agreements. So is that a factor?
Great point. So we took those estimates in that picture that I showed you across different countries and just kind of crudely projected them on country characteristics. And the thing that seemed to drive the relative winner, like being a winner from the trade war as we define it, the thing that seems to correlate it is share of trade covered by deep agreements. Okay. So that seems to be an interesting pattern. It's not super robust, but it seems to be relative to other things like income per capita, for instance.
But analytically, I mean, just one question. Analytically, why would the marginal impact of a tariff on, say, the US or vice versa be affected by whether or not you have let's think of a trade agreement?
Yeah, so you can think about it. I mean, in some version earlier that we had of this framework, we were trying to think about internal reallocations as the country factor. So some countries may have different labor regimes, which make reallocations differences in migration patterns, and it may be that trade agreements, they afford people more information on potential suppliers. I don't have a good micro underpinning, but like I can just think about this as some improvement in flexibility.
As a consequence of the trade agreement.
As a consequence, yeah. I don't want to push this story too hard because it's not a super robust result, but it's not out of the realm of possibility that could be a story that could drive one country to be a bit more flexibly internally relative to another.
And just very quickly, so two additional points, and I would like Aditya to weigh in on this as well, because one of the country factors that could possibly drive reallocation is, of course, political alignment with China or the US. Yeah. Remember, Aditya, about a few months back, you had this working paper or note on how closely UN votes in the UN are aligned with one or the other, which apparently made a difference. So I don't know if that's out in the public yet or not, but if you can opine on that. And the third point I wanted to make was, from where I sit, I see a lot of conflation between the phrase decoupling and deglobalization, which I think is not correct.
Yeah, I agree with that.
Because decoupling is the China and the USA decoupling.
Yes.
It's just reality. So instead of an iPhone being made in China, it's now being made in Vietnam or India.
Yeah.
And if anything, decoupling could lead to more globalization, because if by the virtue of iPhones we make it made in India, India grows faster, then that's more globalization, right?
Yeah.
So do you buy that?
Yes, I buy that. So I mean, one of the messages of this paper is that this trade war between the U.S. and China didn't actually stop Malaysia exporting to Vietnam.
Exactly.
And if anything, it seems to have seen a slight increase. So I buy into this, and I think it's also related to the second point you said about this political alignment. I mean, I think what none of these, and I think this is broadly true of the paper studying the trade war, is that we haven't looked at the export bans, which are coming on very particular products, and there we are going to see two separate communication networks being formed, and in some sense, I think there's a sense in the U.S. that countries will move to the U.S. To the U.S. system, but I don't think that's the case. I mean, China is a major player, and I think in the U.S. it's that this argument is not well thought through. I think in terms of what the implications are, and we should just assume that countries all over the world will just move to the U.S. system for this. But there is not much work happening on this. But this is again where I would say like an analysis of one particular sector focusing on communication devices, for instance, would be particularly interesting. I don't know, Aditya, you probably had more things to say on.
So Aditya's point towards me, it doesn't look like I'm jumping in out of the blue. But thanks for the unpaid promotion. Just to your point, Apurva's point about we've done this little exercise where we're similar to what you've shown here, but instead of the country dummy, we have country characteristic.
Okay.
And there we're exploring different characteristics like political closeness, geographical closeness, market access of these countries that we've shown, and their tariffs on their exports and the tariffs they impose on their inputs.
I see.
So, and then I think the winner among them is mostly political variables recently. The main independent variable there is not tariffs, but whatever China has lost. So across products, the main independent variable is the reduction in China's share. So where are those products?
That's interesting, because that kind of comes up to this point that was made about other policies that might be driving these changes. Yeah, that's interesting. So yeah, we took a somewhat crude. We have a fixed effect, and then we try to look at what's driving that fixed effect, and so then there's other ways. In some sense, we might have knocked out all of our power by using that fixed effect, and we could have gone this route of calling a country a group of characteristics and gotten more leverage out. That's interesting. Yeah.
But that was just spurred by your work, so thanks.
Yeah. But it is interesting, like this political factor you're finding is interesting. It's not a typical trade model story, right? And so I think another message that kind of comes out of this is that we have our economics lens of looking at things, but the individuals making the policy in Washington, D.C. are not always using the economic lenses. And so it's maybe useful for us to be reading what non-economists have to think about in terms of,
So thank you very much. So this is one example of how Amit's work is being foundational and has given rise to deeper work as well as more conversations across political dimensions and economic dimensions. So thank you.
Both deeper and more superficial.
And yes, it's deeper in small ways, but superficial in many ways. So thank you very much, Amit.
Thank you.
Thank you for being here. Very excited it was a great pleasure to have you here. Now we're looking forward to our next day. I know some people want to give you another round of applause, so let's. So looking forward to another day full of exciting papers and then a policy session tomorrow. Tomorrow we also have the Malaysia's Minister for Investment, Trade and MITI, basically, International Trade and Investment, which was rebranded recently. But anyway, so looking forward to it. Please, we'll start tomorrow. The breakfast will start at 8:15. And we'll have a short note and we'll email a short note for presenters. So thank you very much.
What's happening between now and dinner? So यहीं रहना है, यहीं रहेंगे लोग.